The rain pounded mercilessly as Jack Miller's weathered hands worked beneath the hood of a modest Toyota sedan. A simple car, yet still worth several months of his farm income. Mud caked his boots, water soaked through his worn flannel shirt, but his focus never wavered from the sophisticated engine before him. 20 feet away, a woman in a simple but clearly expensive blouse and slacks watched from beneath an umbrella, her manicured fingers clutching a modest wallet. "Please, let me pay you something," she insisted as Jack closed the hood, wiping grease on his already stained jeans. That would have cost thousands at a dealership. Jack simply shook his head, rainwater dripping from his gray-flecked beard. Wouldn't be right to charge for helping a neighbor in need, even a temporary one. He had no idea that the woman watching him refuse payment that could save his failing farm was Alexandra Hayes, CEO of a billion-dollar tech company, who never forgot a debt or the kind souls who helped her with no expectation of return. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Dawn broke over Willow Creek Farm in thin strips of gold that struggled through heavy cloud cover. Jack Miller had already been awake for 2 hours, his calloused hands moving with practiced efficiency through morning chores. The ancient rooster, Rusty, crowed from his perch as if supervising Jack's work, a daily ritual that had continued unchanged for nearly a decade. The 40-acre spread had seen better days. Paint peeled from the once red barn. The farmhouse roof sported mismatched shingles where Jack had made repairs with whatever materials he could afford, and the fences leaned at precarious angles after years of harsh winters. But the soil was good. Rich, dark earth that grew whatever Jack put in it, provided the weather and his ancient equipment cooperated. Jack poured himself a chipped mug of coffee on the porch, surveying his kingdom with a mixture of pride and worry. The morning paper lay on the wooden steps where the delivery boy had tossed it. Jack didn't need to open it to the financial section to know what it would say. Crop prices down again, corporate farms expanding. Small operations, like his becoming endangered species in the modern agricultural landscape. Inside, on his kitchen table, the foreclosure notice from First National Bank sat where he'd left it 3 days ago, the official letterhead seeming to glow with self-importance against the worn wood. 6 months! That's all the time he had left unless something changed dramatically. "Not going to happen today," Jack muttered to himself, the same words he'd spoken every morning since receiving the notice. He tucked the worry away, along with the letter, into a drawer already stuffed with overdue bills. Jack's 1985 Ford pickup groaned in protest as he turned the key, the engine coughing 3 times before reluctantly roaring to life. The odometer had stopped working somewhere north of 300,000 miles. And the blue paint had faded to a patchy gray, but the truck remained the most reliable thing in Jack's life. He patted the dashboard affectionately. "Just you and me, old girl," he said as he shifted into gear, the transmission grinding in familiar complaint. The back of the truck carried a hodgepodge of tools Jack had accumulated over decades. Unlike his struggling farm operation, Jack's mechanical abilities provided a small but steady income. In Willow Creek, population 2,846, Jack Miller was the man you called when something with an engine wouldn't start. As if to prove the point, his ancient flip phone rang as he pulled onto the main road. Martha Jenkins' tractor was acting up again. Jack smiled. Martha, 83, and still running her small orchard single-handedly, always insisted on paying him in home-baked pies rather than cash. Her apple crumble was worth more than money. Anyway, especially when the kitchen at Willow Creek Farm offered little beyond coffee and whatever simple meal Jack could throw together after a long day's work. Turning onto Martha's gravel drive, Jack spotted her tiny figure waving frantically by the barn. Despite his own troubles, seeing Martha's determined independence warmed something in his chest. This was why he stayed, why he fought so hard to keep his failing farm. Willow Creek wasn't just a place. It was people who remembered what community meant. "Jack Miller, you're an angel sent straight from heaven," Martha called as he climbed from the truck, her wrinkled face breaking into a wide smile. "Now, Martha, we both know I'm about as far from an angel as a man can get," Jack replied with a wink, already rolling up his sleeves. 2 hours and one minor carburetor adjustment later, Jack was enjoying thick slices of Martha's pie at her kitchen and table, listening to her latest complaints about her grandson's suggestion that she sell the orchard and move to Florida. Can you imagine? Me in one of those retirement communities with nothing but concrete and palm trees. "I'd shrivel up and blow away in a week," she huffed indignantly. Jack nodded sympathetically, though a small part of him wondered if her grandson didn't have a point. Martha wasn't getting any younger, and neither was he. Maybe fighting against the inevitable was just pride disguised as principle. "How are things at your place, Jack?" Martha asked, her shrewd eyes missing nothing. "Heard the bank's been making noise again." Jack shrugged, uncomfortable with the question, but unwilling to lie to Martha. "Same old story. They want what I haven't got." "That farm's been in your family for 4 generations, Martha said firmly. "Your grandfather would roll over in his grave if you lost it." What Martha didn't say, didn't need to say, was that Jack was the last Miller. There would be no 5th generation to work the land, no children to inherit his legacy or his burdens. His wife, Caroline, had been gone 7 years now, taken by the same cancer that had emptied their modest savings and left Jack with medical bills that still appeared in his mailbox with depressing regularity. Driving home, Jack took the long route that passed the Miller family plot in the small cemetery at the edge of town. He didn't stop. He rarely did these days, but seeing the familiar headstones lined up like sentinels was reminder enough of what he was fighting for. This wasn't just about keeping a farm, it was about honoring promises made to those who could no longer hold him to them. Back at the farm, Jack spent the afternoon replacing a broken tractor belt with one he'd salvaged from the junkyard 2 counties over. His engineering degree from the State University, framed but dust-covered in the rarely used guest room, might seem incongruous with his current life, but Jack had never regretted walking away from a promising career designing agricultural equipment to return home and work the land with his hands. At least, not often. As evening approached, Jack counted the money in his rainy day jar, a literal mason jar kept in the kitchen cupboard. $47 and some change. Not enough for the part he needed to fix the irrigation pump, which meant another day of hauling water to the most vulnerable sections of his vegetable garden by hand. He was just settling in with a simple dinner of beans and cornbread when his phone rang again. Probably Martha, calling to make sure he'd eaten a proper meal. The number, however, wasn't familiar. "Miller," he answered, the single word serving as both identification and greeting. "Mr. Miller? This is Ray down at Pete's gas station. Got a city lady here with car trouble, and Pete's gone home for the day. Told her you might be able to help." Jack sighed, looking longingly at his cooling dinner, but turning down someone in need wasn't in his nature, no matter how tired he was or how little he might be paid. "Tell her I'll be there in 20 minutes, he said, already reaching for his work boots. The jar with its $47 remained on the counter, uncounted and unaugmented. Jack Miller might be poor in pocket, but no one in Willow Creek would ever call him poor in spirit. Pete's gas station sat at the intersection of Highway 14 and Old Mill Road, a weathered outpost of civilization with 2 ancient pumps and a small convenience store that closed promptly at 6. By the time Jack pulled in, fat raindrops were beginning to splatter his windshield, and the dark clouds overhead promised much worse to come. A blue Toyota Camry was parked near the air pump, its hood propped open. Beside it stood a woman with short dark hair, peering into the engine compartment with a cell phone flashlight. Even from a distance, Jack could tell she wasn't from around here. Despite the threatening weather, she wore neat slacks and a button-up blouse that looked like they belonged in an office, not a rural gas station during an approaching storm. Jack parked his truck and grabbed his toolbox from the back. As he approached, the woman looked up, relief visible on her face before it was quickly masked by professional composure. "Mr. Miller?" she asked, extending a hand that was smooth and clearly unaccustomed to manual labor. "Alexandra Hayes. Thank you for coming, out especially with this weather." Jack nodded, setting down his toolbox and wiping his palm on his jeans before shaking her hand. "Just Jack is fine. What seems to be the trouble?" Alexandra, or Alex, as she'd soon insist, gestured helplessly at the engine. "It started making a knocking sound about 10 miles back. Then it got louder, started smoking a little, and finally died completely. I managed to coast in here." Jack murmured, already leaning over the engine. "When's the last time you had the oil changed?" "I'm not sure," she admitted. "The car's a rental. I was supposed to be in Maplewood for meetings tomorrow morning, but the GPS routed me through here to avoid construction." Jack pulled the dipstick, wiped it clean, and reinserted it before checking the oil level. Bone dry. He whistled softly. "That's your problem right there. Engine's probably been running without proper lubrication for a while, might have seized up completely." The first real crack of thunder sounded overhead, and the drizzle suddenly intensified into a downpour. Jack squinted up at the sky. "This isn't going to let up any time soon. Why don't I tow you back to my place? I've got a barn where I can take a better look without drowning us both." Alex hesitated, glancing at her watch. "Is there a mechanic in town who could look at it? Or a tow truck to take me to Maplewood? Nearest mechanic's in Riverdale, 30 miles east, and he won't be open till morning. Hank's Towing doesn't run past 6, and even if they did, they'd charge you triple for. Night service in this weather." Another lightning flash illuminated the frustration on Alex's face. Jack could practically see her calculating options, none of them good. "Look," he said, "I can take a better look at my barn. Maybe it's not as bad as I think. If it is, you can make other arrangements in the morning when this storm's past." The rain was coming down in sheets now, and both of them were getting soaked, despite the minimal shelter provided by the gas station's overhang. Finally, Alex nodded. "Thank you. I appreciate the help." 20 minutes later, Jack had rigged a tow line from his truck to her Toyota and was carefully navigating the increasingly muddy roads back to Willow Creek Farm. In his rearview mirror, he could see Alex following in the Toyota, her expression tense as she steered the powerless vehicle. By the time they reached the farm, the storm had intensified into a full-blown tempest. Wind whipped rain sideways, and lightning cracked overhead with alarming frequency. Jack guided the Toyota into his barn and quickly closed the heavy doors behind them. The interior of the barn was surprisingly tidy, with a small workbench along one wall and various tools hanging in organized rows. The central area, normally occupied by Jack's tractor, had been cleared to make room for the car. "You can wait in the house if you'd prefer," Jack offered, gesturing toward the farmhouse visible through the barn's small windows. "It's not much, but it's dry." "If it's all the same to you, I'd rather see what's wrong with my car," Alex replied, crossing her arms against the barn's damp chill. Jack nodded and set to work, first disconnecting his truck from the Toyota, then gathering the tools he'd need for a proper diagnosis. Alex watched with barely concealed impatience as he methodically examined the engine, occasionally asking questions that revealed she knew next to nothing about how cars worked. "So what's the verdict?" she finally asked as Jack straightened up, wiping his hands on a rag. "Bad news, I'm afraid. Engines seized up. Running without oil caused the pistons to weld themselves to the cylinder walls. You'll need a complete engine. Rebuild, maybe even a replacement." "How long will that take?" Alex asked, her voice tight. "Getting the parts out here, at least a few days? Doing the work, another day or two after that?" Jack saw her expression fall and added, "That's assuming I can even get the specific parts for this model. Might be faster to have it towed to the Toyota dealership in the city. That's not an option, Alex said, her voice sharp with frustration. I have crucial meetings tomorrow. I need to get to Maplewood tonight. Jack glanced out the small barn window at the raging storm. Nobody's going anywhere in this weather. Roads will be flooded by now, especially down by Miller's Creek Bridge. As if to emphasize his point, a particularly violent gust of wind rattled. The barn doors and the lights flickered ominously. Perfect, Alex muttered, pulling out her phone. No signal, just perfect. There's a landline in the house, Jack offered. You're welcome to use it to make whatever calls you need. And I've got a spare room, nothing fancy, but the sheets are clean. For a moment, Alex looked like she might argue, but another crash of thunder seemed to make the decision for her. She nodded reluctantly. I suppose I don't have much choice. Thank you for the offer. Don't mention it, Jack replied, gathering his tools. Once the storm passes, we can figure out next steps. For now, let's get you settled. As they prepared to make a dash for the farmhouse, Jack noticed Alex taking one last look at her disabled car, her expression a mixture of frustration and resignation. Whatever meeting she was missing must be important indeed, though Jack couldn't imagine any business so urgent it couldn't wait out a storm. Ready? He asked, holding a tarp over his head as a makeshift umbrella. Alex nodded, squaring her shoulders as if preparing for battle rather than a simple dash through the rain. Together they pushed through the barn doors into the howling storm, two strangers thrown together by circumstance, heading toward a farmhouse that had rarely seen visitors since Caroline's passing 7 years before. Jack's farmhouse stood as a testament to simpler times, a two-story white clapboard structure with a wide front porch that had weathered countless seasons. Inside, the decor hadn't changed much since Caroline's passing. Practical furniture, worn but clean, filled rooms that were modestly sized by modern standards but had comfortably housed generations of Millers. Sorry about the mess, Jack said automatically as he ushered Alex inside, though there was little actual disorder. The house was Spartan but tidy, with none of the unnecessary clutter that filled most modern homes. Alex stood dripping on the entryway rug, taking in her surroundings with an expression Jack couldn't quite read. Curiosity? Discomfort? Perhaps both. Bathroom's down the hall if you want to dry off, he offered, gesturing toward a doorway. I'll find you something dry to wear. Won't be fashionable, but it'll be warm. Alex looked down at her soaked blouse and slacks, seeming to fully register their condition for the first time. Thank you. That would be helpful. While Alex disappeared into the bathroom, Jack rummaged through a dresser in the spare bedroom, finally extracting an old flannel shirt and a pair of Caroline's jeans that had been neatly folded and stored. Away years ago, he'd never been able to donate her clothes, though he'd told himself countless times that he should. Now, he was oddly grateful for his sentimentality. He left the clothes on the bed and headed to the kitchen to put on a pot of coffee. The old percolator had belonged to his grandmother, and like most things in the Miller household, it was chosen for durability rather than style. The rich aroma of brewing coffee soon filled the kitchen, providing a comforting counterpoint to the storm raging outside. Alex emerged 15 minutes later, her hair damp but neatly combed, swimming in Caroline's flannel shirt, but somehow making it look deliberate rather than ill-fitting. The jeans were rolled up at the ankles, but otherwise suited her slender frame reasonably well. Coffee? Jack offered, already pouring a mug. Please. Alex accepted the steaming cup gratefully. Black is fine. An awkward silence settled between them as they sipped their coffee, the storm providing the only soundtrack. Jack wasn't much for small talk at the best of times, and hosting a stranded city woman was definitely not within his comfort zone. So, Alex finally said, do you think there's any chance of the roads clearing tonight? Jack shook his head. Miller's Creek floods every heavy rain, Bridge will be underwater till morning at least." Alex's face fell. She pulled a sleek smartphone from her pocket, frowned at the screen, and set it down with a sigh. "Still no signal. May I use your landline?" "Help yourself," Jack said, nodding toward the wall-mounted phone that looked like it belonged in a museum compared to her modern device. "Dial 9 first to get an outside line." Alex moved to the phone and dialed a long string of numbers. While she waited for an answer, Jack busied himself at the stove, pulling out a cast-iron skillet and ingredients for a simple meal. He tried not to eavesdrop, but in the small kitchen, it was impossible not to hear her side of the conversation. "James, it's Alex. Yes, I know what time it is." Her voice had shifted, taking on a crisp, authoritative tone Jack hadn't heard from her before. "Listen, I won't make it to Maplewood tonight. Car trouble. I'm stranded until morning at least." She listened for a moment, her expression hardening. "No, that's not acceptable. Reschedule everything. Tell Westridge I'll call him personally. Tomorrow? Yes, I understand the implications. No, you cannot proceed without me. That's final." Another pause, longer this time. "I don't care what Richardson says. The terms aren't favorable enough. I want the full environmental impact assessment before we move forward, and I need to see the community benefit package." "No, James, this isn't about the bottom line. We've discussed this." Jack couldn't help but glance over as her tone grew increasingly frustrated. Alex caught his eye and turned slightly away, lowering her voice, though in the small kitchen this provided little actual privacy. "Just handle it, James. That's what I pay you for. I'll call when I have a better idea of timing." She hung up with a little more force than necessary, then closed her eyes briefly, composing herself before turning back to Jack. "Sorry about that," she said, the authoritative edge still lingering in her voice. "Important business?" Jack asked, adding diced onions to the sizzling skillet. "Something like that," Alex replied vaguely. She took a seat at the kitchen table, which offered a view of the rain-lashed windows and the occasional flash of lightning illuminating the fields beyond. "You mentioned an engine rebuild. Is that something you can do?" Jack nodded, stirring the onions before adding ground beef to the pan. "Used to be an agricultural engineer before I took over the farm. Engines are engines, more or less. Question is whether it's worth the cost for a rental car." "Agricultural engineer," Alex repeated, surprise evident in her tone. "With what company, if you don't mind my asking?" "Hartwell Farming Systems," Jack replied, adding spices to the skillet without measuring. "Designed irrigation equipment mostly. Nothing fancy." Alex's eyebrows rose slightly. "Hartwell is one of the leading agricultural technology companies in the country." Jack shrugged, uncomfortable with her evident reassessment. "That was a lifetime ago. These days I'm just a farmer with a knack for fixing things." The phone rang, interrupting their conversation. Jack wiped his hands on a dish towel before answering. "Miller," he said, then listened for a moment. "Yes, Martha. I heard the storm warnings." "No, you don't need to check your generator. I just serviced it last month. Yes, I'm sure. Call me if anything changes." He hung up with a small smile that faded when he caught Alex watching him curiously. "Martha Jenkins," he explained. 83 years old and thinks she needs to remind me to batten down the hatches every time it rains. "Sounds like you take care of a lot of people around here," Alex observed. Jack turned back to the stove, uncomfortable with her perception. "Neighbors look out for each other, that's all." He served up 2 plates of what turned out to be a surprisingly tasty chili, accompanied by the cornbread left over from the dinner he'd abandoned earlier. They ate in relative silence, the clatter of forks against plates punctuated by rumbles of thunder that seemed to be growing more distant. "This is good," Alex commented, sounding genuinely surprised. "You cook often?" "Every day," Jack replied, simply. "Not much takeout in Willow Creek." After dinner, Jack showed Alex to the spare bedroom. It was simply furnished with a double bed, dresser, and nightstand, but spotlessly clean. A handmade quilt in a wedding ring pattern covered the bed, Caroline's handiwork, though Jack didn't mention this. Bathrooms stocked with towels and whatever else you might need, he said, hovering awkwardly in the doorway. I'll be up at 5 to check on the animals, but I'll try not to wake you. 5? Alex repeated, looking slightly horrified. In the morning? Farm doesn't run itself, Jack said with a small smile. Good night, Miss Hayes. Alex, she corrected automatically. And thank you, Jack, for everything. Jack nodded and retreated downstairs, where he spent the next hour at the kitchen table, reviewing bills and calculating how many more repairs, like Martha's tractor, he would need to make ends meet that month. The numbers, as always, refused to cooperate with his hopes. Upstairs, he could hear the occasional creak of floorboards as his unexpected guest moved about the unfamiliar room. Having someone else in the house felt strange, disruptive but not entirely unwelcome. It had been a long time since the farmhouse had held any presence besides his own. As Jack finally climbed the stairs to his own bedroom, he paused briefly outside the guest room door. From within came the soft murmur of Alex's voice, apparently having found enough cell reception to make one last business call. Absolutely not, he heard her say, her tone leaving no room for argument. I don't care what they're offering. Holloway Farms stays independent, or we walk away completely. Jack continued to his room, puzzled by her words, but too tired to give them much thought. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, fixing a damaged engine, dealing with flooded roads, and hosting a businesswoman clearly desperate to be elsewhere. Whatever Alex Hayes was involved in, it was a world away from the simple struggles of Willow Creek Farm. Jack rose with the first hint of dawn, his body conditioned by decades of early mornings. The storm had passed during the night, leaving behind a glistening landscape and the fresh, clean scent of rain-washed earth. He moved through his morning routine with practiced efficiency. Coffee first, then feeding the animals, checking fences for storm damage, and assessing the fields to see if any young plants had been flattened by the heavy rain. The barn was his final stop. Jack examined Alex's Toyota more thoroughly in the clear morning light, confirming his initial diagnosis. The engine had indeed seized, the damage extensive. He was making a mental inventory of parts he'd need when a voice startled him. Is it as bad as you thought? Jack turned to find Alex standing in the barn doorway. She'd rolled the sleeves of Caroline's flannel shirt to her elbows and exchanged yesterday's soaked dress shoes for a pair of rubber boots he kept by the door, at least 3 sizes too big for her, making her look oddly vulnerable despite her composed expression. Morning, Jack said, surprised to see her up so early. Afraid so. Engines completely seized. Alex approached, peering into the engine compartment, though Jack suspected she wouldn't recognize most components. Can it be fixed? Given enough. Time and parts. Almost anything can be fixed, Jack replied, wiping his hands on a rag. Question is whether it's worth it for a rental. Might be simpler to get it towed to the nearest city dealership. About that, Alex said, grimacing slightly. I called the rental company this morning. Finally got enough signal. They're sending a replacement car, but it won't arrive until tomorrow. Jack nodded, unsurprised. Roads are probably still flooded in spots. Bridge at Miller's Creek was underwater. Last night. An awkward silence fell between them. Alex glanced around the barn, clearly uncomfortable with the forced idleness. Is there something I could do to help? She finally asked. With the farm, I mean. Since I'm stuck here anyway. Jack assessed her. Business casual clothes, smooth hands that had likely never seen hard labor, the slight unease of someone far outside their element. Not necessary, he said. I'm sure you've got calls to make, business to attend to. My phone's almost dead, and I left my charger in the car, Alex replied. Besides, I've already rescheduled everything. Consider it payment for the room and board. The determined set of her jaw told Jack that arguing would be pointless. He shrugged. Suit yourself. I've got irrigation pipes that need checking after the storm. Not exactly glamorous work. Lead the way, Alex said, with more enthusiasm than the prospect of checking irrigation pipes warranted. They spent the next hour walking the eastern field, where Jack grew organic vegetables for the local farmers' market. The storm had clogged several irrigation channels with debris, and they worked side by side, clearing them. Jack efficiently, Alex with determined if clumsy efforts. "You don't have any farmhands?" Alex asked as she struggled to remove a particularly stubborn branch from a drainage ditch. "Can't afford them," Jack answered simply, reaching over to help her with the branch. "Used to hire seasonal help for harvesting, but that was before." He trailed off, not wanting to elaborate on his financial struggles. "Before what?" Alex prompted, wiping mud from her hands onto the already dirty jeans. "Before things got tight," Jack finished vaguely. "Farming's not what it used to be. Small operations like mine are disappearing every year. Why not sell?" The question was direct, businesslike, but not unkind. Jack straightened, looking out over fields his family had worked for generations. "Some things are worth more than money." Alex followed his gaze, seeming to really see the farm for the first time, not just as a collection of dilapidated buildings and muddy fields, but as something living and deeply personal. "Your family's legacy," she said quietly. Jack nodded. "4 generations of millers have worked this land. My grandfather used to say we don't own it. We're just taking care of it for those who come after us." The irony that there would be no one to come after him hung unspoken between them. They moved on to the next task, repairing a section of fence downed by the storm. Jack demonstrated how to set posts and stretch wire, his hands moving with the confident precision that comes from years of repetition. Alex watched carefully before attempting to mimic his technique, her corporate efficiency gradually giving way to practical learning. By mid-morning, they'd moved to the small vegetable garden near the house, where Jack grew produce for his own use. Several young tomato plants had been flattened by the rain. "They need support," Jack explained, showing Alex how to gently tie the vulnerable stems to stakes. "Otherwise, they'll never stand on their own again." "Like businesses," Alex commented, carefully securing a plant. "Sometimes they need external support to survive early challenges." Jack glanced at her with new interest. "Sounds like you're speaking from experience." Alex shrugged, focused on her. "Good task. I've seen my share of struggling enterprises. The promising ones usually just need the right kind of help at the right time." As the morning wore on, Jack found himself impressed by Alex's willingness to tackle unfamiliar tasks. She made mistakes, plenty of them, but approached each failure as a data point rather than a defeat, adjusting her technique until she got results. It was a methodical approach to learning that reminded him of engineers he'd worked with at Hartwell. By noon, they were both mud-splattered and hungry. Jack's opinion of his unexpected guest had shifted subtly. Beneath her polished exterior, Alexandra Hayes had a surprising streak of tenacity and a genuine willingness to get her hands dirty. "Lunch break," Jack announced, heading toward the house. "Then I need to take a look at what parts I might have that could work for your car." Alex followed, examining her dirt-encrusted fingernails with an expression that mixed dismay and satisfaction. "Is this what farm work is always like?" "This," Jack laughed. "This is nothing. Try baling hay in 100-degree heat or calving season in February." "You have cattle?" Alex asked, surprised. "Not anymore," Jack replied, his tone growing more somber. "Had to sell the herd 3 years ago. Couldn't compete with the corporate operations." In the kitchen, Jack made sandwiches while Alex washed up at the sink. Her hands, he noticed, were already showing the beginnings of blisters, badges of unaccustomed labor. "You should wear gloves this afternoon," he said, nodding toward her reddened palms. I've got an extra pair. I'll be fine, Alex insisted, though she flexed her fingers gingerly. Tough doesn't mean stubborn, Jack countered, setting a plate in front of her. No sense making things harder than they need to be. The words hung in the air between them, carrying more weight than the simple advice warranted. Jack had the distinct impression that Alexandra Hayes was someone who routinely made things harder than necessary for herself. Though he couldn't have said why he thought so. After lunch, they walked back to the barn, where Jack began examining the Toyota's engine more thoroughly. Alex watched with obvious curiosity as he methodically disassembled components, laying each part carefully on a clean shop towel. "You really know what you're doing," she observed. Jack shrugged. "Engines make sense. They follow rules. If something's broken, there's always a reason, and usually a fix." "Unlike people," Alex said quietly. Jack glanced up, catching something in her expression, a fleeting vulnerability quickly masked by professional composure. "People are complicated," he agreed, "but they can be fixed too sometimes. Just takes different tools." Alex seemed about to respond when her phone buzzed in her pocket. She checked the screen, her face immediately shifting from the relaxed expression she'd worn while working to something more guarded and professional. "Excuse me," she said, "I need to take this." As she stepped outside the barn to take her call, Jack continued working on the engine, reflecting on the strange circumstance that had brought a clearly successful businesswoman to his failing farm. Whatever else Alexandra Hayes might be, she was a puzzle, and Jack had always enjoyed solving mechanical puzzles. People puzzles, though, were something else entirely. Evening settled over Willow Creek Farm, painting the sky in watercolor hues of orange and purple. Jack and Alex sat on the front porch, nursing mugs of coffee after a day of surprisingly productive work. The Toyota's engine lay partially disassembled. In the barn, Jack having determined that with the right parts he could indeed repair it, though those parts would need to be ordered from the nearest city. "So," Alex said, breaking a comfortable silence, "agricultural engineering to farming. That's quite a career change." Jack's rocking chair creaked softly as he considered his answer. "Not as much as you might think. Still solving problems, just with different tools. But you could have made a good living designing equipment," Alex pressed. "Instead of," she gestured vaguely at the farm with its obvious signs of financial struggle. "Instead of barely scraping by?" Jack finished with a wry smile. "Fair question." He took a sip of coffee, gathering thoughts he rarely put into words. "I didn't leave engineering because I didn't enjoy it. Left because something else mattered. More." The fading light softened Alex's features as she turned to study him. "The farm, partly," Jack acknowledged. "My father had a stroke, couldn't manage a loan anymore. Could have sold the place then, I suppose, but—" He shrugged. "Caroline, my wife. She loved it here. Said she could breathe better away from the city. We had plans." "Had?" Alex caught the past tense immediately. Jack's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. "She passed. Cancer. 7 years ago now." "I'm sorry," Alex said quietly, and Jack could tell she meant it. "Is that why you stayed? To honor what you'd planned together?" The question was perceptive, cutting closer to the truth than Jack was. Entirely comfortable with, he nodded slowly. "We were going to transform the place. Sustainable methods, organic certification, farm-to-table partnerships with restaurants. Caroline had the business sense to make it work." His smile was tinged with sadness. "I've managed the farming part, but the business side, it's a different skill set," Alex offered. "That it is," Jack agreed. "What about you? How does someone like you end up in business consulting?" He remembered her phone conversation about meetings in Maplewood, her authoritative tone with someone named James. Alex hesitated, taking a long sip of coffee before answering. "I sort of fell into it. Started in environmental science, actually. Then got an MBA when I realized policy changes often depend on economic arguments." So you help businesses become more environmentally friendly, Jack guessed. Again, that slight hesitation. Among other things, I specialize in rural development projects, helping businesses operate profitably while benefiting local communities. Jack raised an eyebrow. Sounds idealistic for the corporate world. It can be done, Alex said, with sudden intensity. Businesses don't have to choose between profit and positive impact. The best ones achieve both. The conviction in her voice suggested this wasn't merely professional opinion, but deeply personal belief. Jack found himself curious about what had shaped such certainty. "What brought you to that particular field?" he asked. Alex stared out at the darkening fields for a long moment before responding. "My grandparents were farmers," she said finally. "Small operation, not unlike yours. When I was 12, they lost everything to a corporate buyout that promised jobs and prosperity for the community. Neither materialized. The land was stripped for resources, the jobs went to outsiders, and the profits left the county entirely." Jack nodded, the story depressingly familiar. "Happens all too often." "It changed me," Alex continued. "I decided then that if I ever had the power to influence how business is done in rural areas, I'd make sure local communities benefited. That the people who actually live on the land have a say in what happens to it." The passion in her voice stood in stark contrast to her carefully maintained professional demeanor. Jack found himself seeing past the city clothes and polished presentation to something more authentic. "Noble cause," he said sincerely. Alex seemed almost embarrassed by her own intensity. "Well, idealism meets reality pretty quickly in the business world. But I've managed to hold on to the core principle." Jack was about to ask more when his phone rang. The old landline's jangling seemed almost anachronistic in contrast to Alex's sleek smartphone. He excused himself and went inside to answer it. "Miller?" he said, then listened with growing concern. "When did you get the notice?" "I see. No, Martha, don't sign anything yet. I'll come by tomorrow to look at it." He hung up, his expression troubled as he returned to the porch. "Problem?" Alex asked. "Martha Jenkins, the woman I mentioned yesterday. Someone's offered to buy her orchard, way above market value, but the contract includes mineral rights. She's on a fixed income, so it's tempting for her." "Let me guess," Alex said. "Large company? Promising community investment and local jobs?" Jack raised an eyebrow at her perception. "Something like that. Mid-agro industries. They've been buying up properties all through the county." Alex's posture subtly changed, a new alertness entering. Her expression, "mid-agro, are you sure?" "That's what Martha said. Why?" "You know them." "By reputation," Alex replied carefully. "They have a history of promising one thing and delivering another." Jack sighed, leaning back in the rocking chair. "Martha's not the only one they've approached. Half the farms in the valley have gotten offers, including mine, and," Alex prompted when he didn't continue, "and nothing, not selling." His tone made clear this wasn't negotiable, even if it would solve your financial problems. Jack's jaw tightened. Some things aren't for sale at any price. The ringing of Alex's phone interrupted their conversation. She glanced at the screen and grimaced. "I need to take this," she said, standing. "Work crisis." Jack nodded, watching as she walked to the far end of the porch for privacy. Her voice, when she answered, shifted once again to that tone of calm authority he'd heard previously. Hayes speaking. "Yes, James, I got your message." "No, that timeline doesn't work, because I said so, that's why." Jack deliberately turned his attention to the darkening fields, giving her what privacy he could while remaining on the porch. Still, phrases drifted his way. "The environmental assessment is non-negotiable. I don't care what the board thinks. Remind them who owns controlling interest." Owner, not consultant, Jack realized with surprise. Alexandra Hayes wasn't just a businesswoman. She was apparently the one in charge, whoever she worked for. When She returned. Her expression was tightly controlled, professional mask firmly back in place. "Everything okay?" Jack asked. "Just business," Alex replied dismissively. "Nothing that can't wait until I get back." An awkward silence fell between them. Something had shifted in their dynamic, though Jack couldn't have named exactly what. The easy camaraderie they'd developed while working together had been replaced by an awareness of just how different their worlds truly were. Jack's phone rang again, breaking the tension. This time, it was his neighbor, Bill Thompson, calling. About a tractor part Jack had promised to look for. The conversation was brief, but shifted Jack's mind to practical matters. "I should check on that part for Bill," he said as he hung up, "and see if I can find anything that might work for your car." "Of course," Alex replied. "Don't let me keep you." The words were polite, but Jack thought he detected a note of regret in her voice. Perhaps at the interruption of their conversation, or perhaps at the reminder of the temporary nature of their acquaintance. As Jack headed toward the barn, he found himself unexpectedly reluctant to end their exchange. Alexandra Hayes was unlike anyone he'd met in Willow Creek. Sharp, driven, clearly successful in a world entirely foreign to his own. Yet there was something familiar in her passion for making a difference, in her respect for the land and those who worked it. The rational part of him recognized the absurdity of feeling any connection to someone from such a different sphere, a woman who would undoubtedly return to her corporate life tomorrow and forget all about the struggling farmer who'd fixed her car. Still, he couldn't quite dismiss the sense that their conversation had veered into territory that mattered to them both, revealing unexpected common ground beneath their obvious differences. In the barn, Jack switched on the lights and turned, his attention to the disassembled engine, focusing on the tangible problems he knew how to solve, rather than the puzzling woman on his porch, who would soon be gone from his life as quickly as she had entered it. Night had fully settled over Willow Creek Farm by the time Jack returned to the house. He found Alex in the kitchen, standing before the open refrigerator with a perplexed expression. "I thought I'd make dinner," she explained, "but your refrigerator is minimalist," Jack suggested with a small smile. "I was going to say alarmingly empty, but minimalist works too." Jack moved past her to peer into the sparse interior. "Got eggs? Can make an omelette?" "That works," Alex replied, closing the refrigerator door. "I'm not much of a cook anyway." She watched as Jack efficiently gathered ingredients, eggs a bit, of cheese, the last remnants of a bell pepper, and some herbs from a small pot on the windowsill. His movements in the kitchen were as methodical as his work on machinery, nothing wasted, no step without purpose. "Found some parts that might work." "In for your car," he said as he cracked eggs into a bowl. "Nothing perfect, but enough to get started. Still need to order a few specialized components." "How long will the repairs take?" Alex asked, leaning against the counter. "Hard to say. Once I get the parts, probably a full day's work. But ordering them, getting them delivered out here..." Jack shrugged. "Rural shipping isn't known for speed." Alex nodded, her expression thoughtful. "The rental company is sending a replacement car tomorrow. I really should get to those meetings in Maplewood." "Of course," Jack said, keeping his tone neutral. "You've got work to get back to." He focused on whisking the eggs, oddly aware of Alex's gaze on him. Something about her presence in his kitchen felt simultaneously intrusive and not unwelcome, a contradiction he wasn't entirely comfortable examining. "What would you charge to fix the car?" she asked suddenly. Just out of curiosity, Jack considered the question as he poured the egg mixture into a heated skillet. "Parts would run about 600, labor, call it 12 hours at 60 an hour, roughly 1,300 total." "That seems low," Alex remarked. "A dealership would charge at least twice that." "Dealerships have overhead," Jack replied simply. "I don't." The conversation lapsed into silence as Jack finished cooking. They ate at the small kitchen table, the only sounds the clink of forks against plates and the occasional rumble of distant thunder. The storm was returning. "This is good," Alex said, gesturing to the simple omelette. "You really do know your way around a kitchen." "Necessity," Jack explained. "Been cooking for myself since Caroline passed." The mention of his late wife hung briefly in the air between them. Jack rarely spoke of Caroline to anyone, and the ease with which her name had slipped into conversation surprised him. "How long were you married?" Alex asked gently. 15 years. Jack's voice held no self-pity, just a matter-of-fact acceptance. "High school sweethearts, if you can believe something that cliché." Alex smiled. "I can. You seem like the loyal type." "Some might call it stubborn," Jack countered with a wry smile of his own. After dinner, the returning storm made itself known with increased intensity. Rain lashed against the windows, and the wind moaned around the eaves of the old farmhouse. Jack built a small fire in the living room fireplace, partly for warmth in the drafty house, partly from habit in anticipating potential power outages. "The roads will flood again," he observed, watching the flames catch on the seasoned oak logs. "Your replacement car might be delayed." Alex nodded, accepting this news with surprising equanimity for someone who had been so anxious to leave just the day before. "I've rescheduled everything important. One more day won't matter." The power flickered once, twice, then stabilized. Both of them looked up at the old chandelier, its light wavering uncertainly. "Happens every big storm," Jack explained. "Backup generators ready if needed." As if on cue, the lights went out completely, plunging the house into darkness, relieved only by the fireplace's warm glow. Jack moved through the darkness with confident familiarity, locating an old oil lamp on the mantel and lighting it with impracticed ease. "Generators in the barn," he said, placing the lamp on the coffee table. "I'll need to start it manually." "I'll come with you," Alex offered, rising from her seat by the fire. "Better than sitting alone in the dark." Jack handed her a flashlight from a drawer in the side table. "Path gets muddy." They made their way to the barn through driving rain, Jack leading with confident steps despite the darkness. Inside, the barn was eerily quiet, the rain a dull roar against the metal roof. Jack headed directly to a tarp-covered shape in the corner, revealing a well-maintained generator that looked newer than most equipment on the farm. "One thing I don't skimp on," he explained, checking fuel levels. "Power goes out, crops can wait, but the well pump can't." Alex held the flashlight steady as Jack worked, her face thoughtful in the beam's reflection. "You've thought of everything." "Try to," Jack replied, making final adjustments before pulling the starter cord. The generator sputtered, coughed, then roared to life. "That should run the essentials. Pump, refrigerator, a few lights. Not much else." "Is this what farming is always like?" Alex asked as they walked back toward the house. "Constantly preparing for the next crisis?" Jack considered her question. Surprisingly insightful from someone who had never lived rural. "Pretty much. Nature's not predictable or particularly forgiving. You learn to anticipate what might go wrong and prepare as best you can. Like running a business," Alex observed, "except your unpredictable variables are weather and natural disasters instead of market fluctuations and competitor moves." "Never thought of it that way," Jack admitted, "but I suppose there are similarities." Back in the relative warmth of the house, with minimal lighting restored, they settled again near the fireplace. Jack checked his phone for weather alerts. Thankfully, the landline worked regardless of power status. "Storm's supposed to pass by morning," he reported, "but Miller's Creek will definitely flood again." Alex nodded, seeming less concerned with this news than she might have been a day earlier. She had kicked off her borrowed boots and curled into the armchair, looking far more relaxed than the businesswoman who had arrived at his farm by accident. "I should check your car," Jack said, suddenly remembering he'd left tools and parts scattered around the Toyota's open engine. "Make sure everything's covered properly with this rain." "Now?" In this weather? Alex looked skeptical, but Jack was already pulling on his coat. Won't take long. Engine parts and water don't mix well. To his surprise, Alex once again rose to accompany him, tugging on the oversized boots despite his insistence that she could stay in the warm house. Together, they braved the downpour a second time, hurrying across the muddy yard to the barn. Inside, Jack moved quickly to cover the disassembled engine parts with clean shop towels, explaining each component to Alex as he worked. To his surprise, she asked intelligent questions that revealed a genuine interest, even if her technical knowledge was limited. "This is the cylinder head," he explained, carefully wrapping the part. "Heat and pressure build up here during combustion. Your problem was that without proper oil, the metal surfaces actually welded themselves together from the friction and heat." "And you can fix that?" Alex asked, inspecting the scored metal surface. "With the right parts, yes. This engine's common, enough that replacements shouldn't be too hard to find." A particularly violent gust of wind rattled the barn doors, making them both look up. Through the small windows, the night was pitch black, the storm having swallowed all ambient light. "Reminds me of my grandfather's farm during hurricane season," Alex said quietly. "We'd all huddle in the kitchen while the wind tried to tear the roof off." Jack glanced at her, struck by this glimpse into her past. "You spent a lot of time there? On your grandparents' farm?" Alex nodded, her expression softening with memory. "Every summer until I was 12. Then they lost the place and moved to a small apartment in the city. It was different." "Different how?" Jack asked, genuinely curious. "Grandfather changed," Alex replied, her voice dropping slightly. "He'd been so vibrant on the farm, always moving, building, growing things. In the apartment, he just faded, like someone had unplugged his power source." She looked around the barn, taking in the tools, the equipment, the functional workspace. "I think I understand why now. This kind of life gets into your blood." Jack nodded, recognizing the truth in her words. "That it does." They worked side by side for another half hour, Jack explaining his repair strategy while Alex held the flashlight and occasionally handed him tools. Despite their vastly different backgrounds, Jack found himself impressed by her quick understanding of mechanical principles. She might not know the terminology or the specific functions, but she grasped the underlying logic with surprising speed. "Engineering degree helps," she admitted when he commented on this. "Even environmental engineering requires understanding basic mechanical principles." "Environmental engineering?" Jack raised an eyebrow. "Thought you said business consulting." Alex hesitated fractionally. "I did both. Engineering first, then business school." Jack sensed there was more to the story but didn't press. Everyone had aspects of their past they preferred not to discuss. He certainly did. With the engine properly protected from the elements, they made one final dash through the rain to the house. Both were soaked, despite the brief exposure, and Jack stoked the fire higher, while Alex disappeared upstairs to change into dry clothes. When she returned, her hair was toweled semi-dry, and she'd changed back into Caroline's flannel shirt and jeans. She looked younger somehow, less like a polished professional and more like someone who might belong in a farmhouse kitchen. The thought unsettled Jack slightly, and he busied himself making hot coffee on the gas stove, which thankfully didn't require electricity. When he turned back, Alex was studying the single-framed photo on the mantel. Jack and Caroline on their wedding day, young and smiling, with all the certainty of those who haven't yet faced life's harder challenges. "She was beautiful," Alex said simply. "Yes," Jack agreed, handing her a steaming mug. "She was." They sat in companionable silence, listening to the storm rage outside while the fire cast dancing shadows across the walls. For the first time in years, Jack found himself grateful for a power outage and flooded roads. circumstances that had unexpectedly brought a stranger into his carefully isolated life, and, even more unexpectedly, made her feel less like a stranger with each passing hour. Jack woke to the rhythmic plop of water hitting wood. He followed the sound to Alex's room, where water was seeping through the ceiling. "Roof's compromised," Jack explained after waking her. "If it's leaking here, the hay in the barn is probably soaked." They rushed to the barn to find water streaming through the hayloft ceiling. Without hesitation, Jack climbed up and began tossing dry bales down to Alex. "Move them to the back," he called. "Away from the leak." Alex worked without complaint, hauling heavy bales despite her obvious inexperience. Jack was impressed by her determination. "How much does hay cost to replace?" she asked, wiping sweat from her forehead. "About $8 per bale, but good hay's hard to find this time of year. So we're looking at hundreds in damage. Plus, roof repairs?" Jack nodded grimly. "Insurance won't cover it, deductibles too high." "That seems fundamentally unfair," Alex said, her voice taking on a passionate edge. "Agricultural insurance should be more accessible to small operations. When insurance, financing, and market access all favor large corporate farms, we lose the diversity that small farms provide. It's short-sighted economics." Jack studied her with new interest. "You sound like you've studied agricultural economics." Alex seemed to catch herself. "Just part of my consulting work." They had nearly finished when a section of roof gave way. With a loud crack, Alex reacted instantly, shoving Jack sideways as roofing crashed down where he'd been standing. "Are you okay?" she asked, rolling off him. "Thanks to you, good reflexes." "Competitive tennis in college," she replied, looking embarrassed by the admission. They spent the next 2 hours patching the roof before checking on the Toyota. Thankfully, the car remained dry. "I've ordered parts from my supplier," Jack said, then frowned at an incoming text. "But apparently my credit application was denied. Can't get parts without payment up front." Alex touched his arm. "Let me pay for the parts. It's my car, after all." "That's not how I do business," Jack said stiffly. Before she could argue, a rental car arrived. While Alex handled the paperwork, Jack retreated to the house, humiliated by the credit rejection. His phone rang. Martha Jenkins calling about another Midagro visit. "They're offering even more now," she explained. "Something about an agricultural showcase for the valley. They mentioned your farm specifically, said it was integral to their vision." After hanging up, Jack watched Alex through the window, noting how confidently she handled the transaction. When she returned to the kitchen, they ate in uncomfortable silence. A notification chimed on Alex's phone. She stared at it with sudden intensity, her expression troubled. Simultaneously, Jack's phone buzzed with a news alert. Hayes Innovation CEO missing during crucial acquisition talks. Alexandra Hayes, unreachable as mid-agro industries circles. Willow Creek Valley. He looked up slowly, finding Alex's eyes already on him. "Alexandra Hayes," he said carefully, "CEO of Hayes Innovations, not a business consultant." Alex set down her phone with deliberate calm. "I can explain." Silence hung between them for a long moment. Jack's expression remained carefully neutral as he waited for Alex to continue. "I wasn't deliberately lying," she began, setting her sandwich down. "Just simplifying. It seemed easier than explaining who I really was." "CEO of Hayes Innovations," Jack stated flatly. "That's quite a simplification." Alex met his gaze directly. "Would you have treated me the same if you'd known?" The question caught Jack off guard. He considered it honestly before answering, "Probably not." "That's why I didn't say anything. The moment people hear CEO or millionaire, everything changes." Jack gestured toward the news alert still visible on his phone. "So, what's this about acquisition talks in mid-agro industries?" Alex's posture stiffened slightly. "That's partly why I was traveling through this area." Hayes Innovations specializes in sustainable agricultural technology. We've been expanding into rural development partnerships and mid-agro. They're our main competition, except they have a very different vision for rural America. Alex's voice hardened. They buy land cheap, extract resources, and leave communities worse off. We've been trying to outbid them in several regions, including Willow Creek Valley. Jack leaned back in his chair, processing this information. So all those farms being approached by mid-agro, we've been making counteroffers where we can, Alex confirmed, but we've been at a disadvantage. Mid-agro has been operating in stealth mode through shell companies. I was coming to meet with local farmers personally to present our alternative vision until your car broke down. Until my car broke down, Alex agreed with a rueful smile, and I ended up getting help from the very person whose farm is apparently integral to mid-agro's plans. Jack's eyes narrowed. Martha mentioned that. Why would my farm be so important to them? Location, probably. Your property controls water access for half the valley. Alex pulled up a map on her phone, enlarging it to show the region. See how Miller's Creek runs through your land. Anyone wanting to develop large-scale operations would need control of that water source. Jack studied the map, seeing his familiar home from a strategic perspective for the first time. And you? Is my farm integral to Hayes Innovations' plans too? Honestly, yes. Alex's directness was disarming, but not in the way you might think. We don't want to buy you out. We want partnerships with established local farmers who can help implement sustainable practices throughout the region. Jack stood abruptly, moving to the window to stare out. At Fields, his family had worked for generations. The revelation that his struggling farm was suddenly valuable to competing corporations was difficult to process. "Why should I believe you?" he asked finally. "How do I know Hayes Innovations isn't just mid-agro with better PR?" Instead of being offended, Alex looked almost relieved by his skepticism. "You shouldn't just believe me. Research us. Talk to communities where we've worked. Our company ethos is about preserving family farms while making them economically viable in today's market." "Pretty words," Jack commented, turning back to face her. "I've heard plenty of those from people trying to buy this land. I understand your skepticism," Alex replied. "But consider this. If I just wanted your land, why would I have kept my identity secret? I could have disclosed who I was immediately, offered you a generous sum, and been done with it." It was a fair point, Jack had to admit. Still, he'd been in business long enough to recognize when he was at a disadvantage in negotiations. Alexandra Hayes clearly held cards he didn't even know were in play. "So what happens now?" he asked. "I need to get to Maplewood," Alex said. "Mid-agro's moving faster than we anticipated. If I don't intervene quickly, they could lock up half the valley before we can present alternatives. And my car, I'll pay for the parts, you fix it, and we settle up when it's done." Alex stood, gathering her few belongings. "But I'd like to continue our conversation when I return. Hayes Innovations is genuinely interested in what you're doing here, Jack, not in buying you out, in working with you." Jack's instinct was to refuse outright, to tell her to take her rental car and corporate machinations elsewhere. But something in her sincerity gave him pause. That, and the undeniable reality that without some kind of intervention, Willow Creek Farm might not survive. "Another year. I'll think about it," he conceded finally. Alex nodded, accepting this as the most she could expect. "That's all I ask." The atmosphere between them had shifted dramatically. The easy camaraderie they'd developed while working side by side was replaced by a cautious formality as Alex gathered her things and prepared to leave in the rental car. Standing on the porch as she loaded her bag into the SUV, Jack wrestled with conflicting emotions. Part of him felt betrayed by her deception, however well-intentioned. Another part recognized that the Alexandra Hayes who had hauled hay bales and handed him tools in the rain wasn't fundamentally different from the CEO now preparing to leave. "I meant what I said about fixing your car," he called, as she opened the driver's door. "Parts or no parts?" Alex paused, looking back at him with a soft smile that seemed genuinely regretful. "And I meant what I said about Hayes Innovations' interest in your farm. When I come back for the car, I'd like to bring some information about the partnerships we've established with other family farms." Jack nodded non-committally. "Drive safely. Roads might still be bad near Miller's Creek." "I will." Alex hesitated, then added, "Thank you, Jack. Not just for the car, but for everything." As she drove away, Jack remained on the porch long after. The rental car had disappeared down the long driveway. His world, which had seemed so immovably fixed just 2 days ago, had suddenly become complicated in ways he couldn't have imagined. Inside, he found the envelope Alex had left on the kitchen table. Inside was enough cash to cover the parts needed for her car, plus a handwritten note with her direct phone number. "In case you have questions," she'd written, "about the car or anything else." Jack set the envelope aside and pulled out his laptop, an ancient machine he rarely used. It took nearly 5 minutes to boot up, the internet connection via satellite painfully slow. But gradually he began researching Hayes Innovations and Alexandra Hayes herself. What he found surprised him. Hayes Innovations had begun 8 years ago as a small startup focused on improving irrigation efficiency for small farms. Under Alexandra's leadership, it had grown into a significant player in sustainable agricultural technology, with a consistent record of partnerships rather than acquisitions. Most striking were the testimonials from family farmers who credited the company with saving their operations through innovative collaboration models. Alexandra Hayes herself had an even more interesting story. Granddaughter of farmers who had lost everything to corporate acquisition, she had leveraged an inheritance from her other grandparents, successful urban entrepreneurs, to create a company specifically designed to prevent stories like her family's from repeating. The more Jack read, the more his initial skepticism began to waver. By the time he shut down the computer, his anger at her deception had been largely replaced by curiosity about exactly what kind of partnership Hayes Innovations might envision for Willow Creek Farm. Jack pulled out the foreclosure notice from his drawer, studying the timeline with fresh eyes. 6 months. Maybe, just maybe, Alexandra Hayes's unexpected appearance represented not another threat to his farm's independence, but a last-minute reprieve from losing it altogether. The day after Alex's departure stretched before Jack with an emptiness he hadn't anticipated. He moved through his morning chores mechanically, his mind replaying conversations with Alex and processing the revelations about her identity. The farmhouse felt unusually quiet, the absence of his temporary guest more noticeable than it should have been after such a brief stay. By mid-morning, Jack had ordered the parts for the Toyota using the cash Alex had left. His supplier sounded surprised when Jack mentioned he'd be paying up front, a departure from their usual arrangement. "Credit issue sorted out that quickly, huh?" the supplier commented. "Something like that," Jack replied, unwilling to explain. The actual circumstances. With the parts scheduled to arrive within 3 days, Jack turned his attention to repairing the barn roof properly. The temporary patch he and Alex had installed would hold for now, but a more permanent solution couldn't wait. The foreclosure notice might give him 6 months, but that didn't mean he could neglect necessary maintenance in the meantime. As he worked, his phone rang repeatedly, neighbors calling to ask about the Mid-Agro representatives making renewed rounds through the valley. Martha, Bill Thompson, even old Peterson, who rarely used his phone, all wanting Jack's opinion on whether the offers were genuine or just corporate double talk. They're offering guaranteed purchase of crops at above-market rates for 5 years. Bill explained, obvious temptation in his voice. Say they want to showcase traditional farming methods to visitors. And what happens after 5 years? Jack countered. When they own half the valley and you're dependent on their business? The conversations left Jack mentally exhausted. He understood the temptation his neighbors faced. Most were in similar or worse financial situations than his own, with retirement looming and no clear succession plan for their farms. The promise of financial security was powerful. By evening, Jack had patched the roof and was checking his phone messages when he noticed a text from an unknown number. It was brief and to the point. Meeting in Maplewood successful. Will explain when I return for the car. Thank you again. Alex. Despite himself, Jack felt a small surge of anticipation at the prospect of Alex's return. He was still processing the revelation of her true identity, still unsure whether to view Hayes Innovations as potential savior or just another corporate threat dressed in nicer clothing. But he couldn't deny his curiosity to hear more. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor. Jack was mucking out the small stable that once housed his workhorses when a sleek black SUV pulled into the driveway. A man in an expensive suit emerged, his leather shoes immediately gathering mud from the still damp yard. "Mr. Miller," the man called, picking his way carefully toward the stable. "Thomas Westridge, Mid-Agro Industries." Jack set down his pitchfork, wiping his hands on his jeans before extending one to the visitor. "What can I do for you, Mr. Westridge?" The man's handshake was firm but brief, as though he didn't want to maintain contact too long with a working farmer. "I understand you've declined our previous offers for your property." "That's right," Jack confirmed. "Not interested in selling." Westridge smiled, the expression not reaching his eyes. "Perhaps our representatives didn't properly convey the scope of Mid-Agro's vision for Willow Creek Valley. We're not simply buying land. We're creating an agricultural showcase that will bring tourism, jobs, and economic revitalization to the entire region." "Heard something similar," Jack replied neutrally. "Then you'll understand why your property is so crucial to our plans," Westridge continued smoothly. "Miller's Creek runs through your land, providing the water access essential for our development. As a gesture of goodwill, I'm authorized to offer you double our initial proposal." He handed Jack a folder containing paperwork with a number that momentarily took his breath away. It was enough to pay off all his debts, buy a comfortable house elsewhere, and still have a substantial nest egg for retirement. "That's a generous offer," Jack acknowledged, closing the folder without signing anything. "We think it's fair compensation for a property that, frankly, is not thriving under current management." Westridge's tone remained pleasant, but the implication was clear. No offense intended, of course. Market forces have made traditional small farming nearly impossible. Jack studied the man carefully, noting the calculated combination of carrot and stick in his approach. "And what happens to the other farms in the valley if I sell?" Westridge spread his hands in a gesture of openness. "Those that fit our vision will be incorporated into the development. The others will likely transition naturally as the region evolves." "Transition naturally," Jack repeated, "meaning they'll be squeezed out once you control the water rights." A flicker of annoyance crossed Westridge's face before his professional mask returned. "Mr. Miller, I understand your attachment to traditional farming methods, but progress is inevitable. The question is whether you'll benefit from it or be left behind." "I'll consider your offer," Jack said, though they both knew he wouldn't. "Please do." Westridge handed him a business card. "We're moving forward with or without Willow Creek Farm, but we'd prefer it to be with, for historical reasons, if nothing else." After Westridge departed, Jack stood in the driveway watching dust settle behind the expensive SUV. The encounter had left him uneasy. Mid-Agro's Interest in his farm clearly went beyond simple land acquisition. The water rights were the real prize. And Westridge's subtle threat about moving forward with or without him suggested they had alternative plans if he continued to refuse. That evening, while reviewing the mid-agro proposal more carefully, Jack discovered an envelope that had slipped from the folder. Inside was a newspaper clipping about a recent Hayes Innovations project that had failed environmental review, with a handwritten note. Ask yourself if you can trust people who hide their true identity and intentions. The targeted message confirmed what Jack had already suspected. Mid-agro knew about Alex's visit to his farm and was actively working to undermine any potential arrangement with Hayes Innovations. Jack's phone rang as he was contemplating this new development. "Miller," he answered absently. "Jack, it's Alex. I'm heading back to collect my car tomorrow." Her voice was professional but warm. "I'd like to discuss some ideas for Willow Creek Farm if you're open to it." Jack hesitated, the mid-agro proposal, and clipping still in front of him. "Sure," he said finally. "I've got some questions of my own." "I expected you would," Alex replied, a smile evident in her voice. "See you tomorrow around noon." After hanging up, Jack returned to his research on both companies. The more he learned, the more complex the situation became. Both Mid-Agro and Hayes Innovations had compelling business cases. Both claimed to support rural communities. Both wanted his land, though in different ways and for different purposes. The key difference, Jack realized, wasn't in their corporate materials or public statements. It was in what he had observed firsthand. Alexandra Hayes had worked alongside him in the rain and mud without complaint. She had helped save his hay, pushed him out of danger when the roof collapsed, and respected his space and privacy even when revealing her true identity. Thomas Westridge, by contrast, hadn't even been willing to get his expensive shoes dirty. It wasn't a business analysis by any means, but as Jack finally went to bed, he found himself looking forward to Alex's return with cautious optimism. Jack was repairing a fence in the north pasture when he heard the crunch of tires on gravel. Checking his watch, he realized it was already past noon. Alex was punctual, something he appreciated in a world where time often seemed more suggestion than rule to many people. He made his way back to the farmhouse, arriving just as a silver SUV pulled into the driveway. Unlike Thomas Westridge's visit, this vehicle wasn't ostentatious, practical luxury rather than conspicuous wealth. It suited what he had learned about Alexandra Hayes and her company. Alex emerged looking very different from the woman who had left in borrowed clothes days before. Now she wore a professional but practical outfit, tailored slacks, a simple blouse, and low heels that wouldn't immediately surrender to the farm's terrain. Her hair was neatly styled, her appearance polished. "Without being pretentious, Jack," she greeted him with a warm smile. "It's good to see you again." "Likewise," he replied, genuinely meaning it despite his lingering wariness. "How were your meetings?" "Productive but challenging." Alex gestured toward the porch. "Do you have time to talk? I've brought some materials I'd like to share with you." Inside, they settled at the kitchen table, where Alex opened a slim leather portfolio. Jack noticed she'd chosen the kitchen rather than the more formal living room, a small detail that suggested she remembered and respected the farm's daily rhythms. "Before I begin," Alex said, "I want to apologize again for not being completely forthcoming about my identity. It wasn't my intention to mislead you." Jack nodded, appreciating the direct approach. "Water under the bridge, though I'm curious why the CEO of Hayes Innovations was driving herself to meetings rather than flying or having a driver." Alex smiled. "I like to see the communities we work with firsthand. Highways and back roads tell you things about a region that you can't learn from reports or flyovers." She paused. "Plus, I hate flying in small planes." The admission was unexpectedly human, and Jack found himself smiling in return. "Fair enough. So what's this proposition you mentioned?" I'm assuming Thomas Westridge visited while I was gone, Alex said, surprising him with her insight. How did you know? Midagro's playbook is predictable. Once they knew I'd been here, they would have escalated their approach. She raised an eyebrow. Am I right? Jack nodded. Offered double their original number and highlighted your farm's water rights as crucial to their development plans. You've done your homework, Jack acknowledged, impressed despite himself. It's my job to understand the strategic value of agricultural properties, Alex replied. Miller's Creek is the lifeblood of this valley. Whoever controls that waterway effectively controls regional development. She opened her portfolio, removing several photographs and documents. Here's what Midagro won't tell you, she continued, laying out images of various farming regions. These are communities where they've implemented similar showcase developments. Initial investment is always impressive, new facilities, roads, promotional materials, but within 5 years, the focus inevitably shifts. The progression of photos told a clear story. Initial development giving way to intensive resource extraction, decreased local employment, and environmental degradation. This is the Jameson Valley Project, Alex explained, pointing to particularly striking before and after images. Midagro promised an agricultural tourism destination that would preserve traditional farming while creating new jobs. 3 years later, they'd converted most arable land to high-intensity cash crops, automated operations to minimize labor costs, and were diverting water resources to their processing facilities. Jack studied the photos carefully. And Hayes Innovations offers something different. We do, Alex confirmed, producing another set of documents. We're proposing a true partnership, not an acquisition. You would maintain ownership and operational control of Willow Creek Farm while we provide capital investment for improvements and expansion. She outlined a detailed proposal. Hayes Innovations would fund sustainable infrastructure improvements, modernized irrigation, renewable energy, systems, equipment upgrades, in exchange for establishing a small research facility on a portion of his land. This facility would develop and test new agricultural technologies specifically designed for small to mid-sized farms. You'd receive a percentage of revenues from any innovations developed here, Alex explained, plus guaranteed premium pricing for crops used in our farm-to-table initiative with regional restaurants and grocery chains. Jack listened attentively, weighing each element of the proposal against his own knowledge of the farm's needs and potential. It was comprehensive, addressing both immediate financial concerns and long-term sustainability. What's the catch? He asked finally. This sounds too good to refuse. Alex appreciated his directness. The catch is that we're asking for a long-term commitment, minimum 10 years. During that time, you'd need to implement certain sustainable farming practices and allow regular monitoring of environmental impacts. Some of these methods might require adjusting techniques your family has used for generations. She paused, seeming to choose her next words carefully. And to be completely transparent, we see Willow Creek Farm as the cornerstone of a larger regional initiative. Your participation would give our proposal credibility with other local farmers. You want me to be your poster boy, Jack translated. I wouldn't put it that way, Alex replied with a small smile. But your farm's history and your reputation in the community would certainly help our cause. Jack rose from the table, needing physical movement to process everything she'd presented. The proposal was fundamentally different from Midagro's straightforward buyout offer. This was complex, nuanced, forward-looking rather than extractive. Why? And B, he asked finally, there are bigger farms in the valley, ones in better financial shape. Alex's expression softened slightly. Because in addition to the strategic value of your land, you've demonstrated a commitment to this place that goes beyond profit. You've chosen to stay and fight for this farm when selling would have been easier. That kind of dedication is exactly what we're looking for in our partners." Her answer struck uncomfortably close to Jack's heart. He turned to face her directly. "I'll need time to consider this," he said. "It's not a decision I can make on the spot." "Of course," Alex agreed immediately. "Take as much time as you need. The official proposal is all here, along with case studies of our other partnerships. My direct number is included if you have questions." She glanced at her watch. "I should get going if I want to make my next meeting. When do you think my car will be ready?" "Parts should arrive tomorrow," Jack replied. "Probably have it running by the weekend." "Perfect. I can arrange to have someone pick me up then." The conversation shifted to practicalities about the Toyota repair, though both were clearly still processing the weight of what had just been discussed. As they walked out to Alex's rental car, Jack found himself reluctant to end their meeting, despite the overwhelming amount of information he needed to consider. "One more question," he said as Alex prepared to leave. "If I say no, what happens to your plans for the valley?" Alex considered this thoughtfully. "We'd proceed, but with a different approach. Your farm is ideal for what we envision, but we're committed to this region regardless. We'd find alternatives, and mid-grow, they'll continue pursuing their agenda with or without us," Alex replied frankly. "The question is whether the community will have a viable alternative to consider." With that sobering thought, they said their goodbyes. Jack watched the silver SUV disappear down his driveway, then returned to the kitchen where Alex's proposal still lay open on the table. He sat down heavily, overwhelmed by the responsibility suddenly resting on his shoulders. It wasn't just his farm's future at stake now, but potentially the entire valley's. Whatever decision he made would have ripple effects throughout the community, for better or worse. For 3 days, Jack mulled over Alex's proposal, reading through the materials she'd left until the pages were dog-eared. The partnership offered exactly what Willow Creek Farm needed: capital for improvements, guaranteed premium pricing for crops, and a path toward sustainable profitability. Yet something held him back from immediately accepting a lifetime of caution when dealing with outsiders making promises about the future. On the 4th day, with the Toyota's parts delivered and repairs underway, Jack decided he needed perspective beyond his own. He tucked Alex's proposal into his truck and headed into town. His first stop, the small house where Martha Jenkins had lived since selling her Orchard's main residence after her husband's death. Martha answered the door in a flour-dusted apron, the smell of fresh-baked pie wafting from behind her. "Jack Miller, right on time for dessert," she declared, with the uncanny timing of someone who had been feeding neighbors for over 60 years. Inside her small kitchen, Jack accepted a generous slice of apple pie and waited until Martha had settled across from him before pulling out the proposal. "I need your thoughts on something," he said, sliding the folder toward her. Martha adjusted her reading glasses and examined the documents with surprising thoroughness, asking occasional clarifying questions. Despite her age and limited formal education, she had a farmer's shrewdness when it came to evaluating promises. "This isn't like Midagro's offer," she said finally. "They wanted to buy us out completely, make us renters on our own land if we stayed at all." "That's what I thought too," Jack agreed. "But is it too good to be true?" Martha removed her glasses, fixing Jack with a penetrating look. Caroline would have liked this approach. Remember how she used to talk about modernizing without losing? The farm's soul, the mention of his late wife, caused Jack's throat to tighten unexpectedly. She did have that vision. "The real question," Martha continued gently, "is whether you trust this Alexandra Hayes. Documents are just paper. It's people who keep or break promises." Jack nodded, Martha's practical wisdom cutting to the heart of his dilemma. "She worked alongside me during the storm, helped save the hay, patched the barn roof, didn't complain once about the conditions." "That tells you something important," Martha observed, "more than any corporate brochure could." From Martha's house, Jack drove to Wilson's Diner, the unofficial town meeting place, where farmers gathered for coffee and conversation between errands. As he'd hoped, several local landowners were already there, including Bill Thompson and old Peterson, both of whom had received offers from Midagro. Jack joined their table, ordering coffee before steering the conversation toward the competing interests in the valley. "Heard Hayes Innovations is making the rounds now too," Bill said, stirring sugar into his coffee. "Offering partnerships instead of buyouts. Sounds complicated." "What do we know about them?" Jack asked, trying to sound casual. Old Peterson, typically, a man of few words, surprised everyone by producing a printout from his overall pocket. Did some research. Hayes Innovations has a clean record. Environmental awards, fair labor practices. CEO started the company using inheritance money after her grandparents lost their farm to corporate consolidation. Jack tried not to show his surprise at Peterson's thoroughness. "You've been looking into them." "Got grandkids who'll inherit my place someday," Peterson replied simply. "Need to know who's circling our community." The conversation expanded as more farmers joined their table. Some were skeptical of any outside company, regardless of its approach. Others were cautiously optimistic about Hayes Innovations based on what they'd heard from farming communities in neighboring counties. "My cousin works with them in Riverdale," offered Frank Williams, who ran the feed store. "Says they actually delivered on their promises. New irrigation systems cut his water usage by 40% while increasing yields." "Still," countered Bill, "once you're in bed with these corporate types, they've got leverage. What happens if they change their approach down the road?" It was a valid concern, one Jack had wrestled with himself. As the debate continued, he noticed a distinct difference from similar discussions in the past. For the first time in years, the farmers of Willow Creek were talking about possibilities rather than just survival. The presence of competing visions for their valley had introduced something long missing from their conversation: choice. After lunch, Jack made one final stop at the small cemetery on the edge of town. He rarely visited Caroline's grave, preferring to remember her in the spaces where she had lived rather than where she rested. But today, he felt the need for a different kind of consultation. Standing before the simple headstone, Jack spoke aloud, feeling only slightly self-conscious. "Could use your business sense right about now, Caro." The wind rustled through nearby oak trees, Caroline's favorite. Jack smiled slightly at the timing. "Hayes Innovations is offering almost exactly what you wanted for the farm," he continued. "Sustainable methods, premium crop contracts, even the farm-to-table restaurant connections you talked about." He knelt, brushing away fallen leaves from the base of the headstone. "But it means bringing outsiders into our operation, changing how we do things, taking a risk." No answer came beyond the continued gentle rustling of leaves, but Jack felt a sense of clarity emerging nonetheless. Caroline had always been the visionary in their partnership, the one who saw possibilities where he saw complications. She had pushed him to think beyond mere survival to what their farm could become. "You'd tell me to take the chance," he murmured. "You always did." As Jack drove home, the accumulated wisdom of his day settled into a more coherent perspective. Martha's emphasis on character over contracts, the community's cautious hope for something beyond Midagro's extractive approach. Caroline's remembered voice encouraging innovation and growth. Back at the farm, Jack spent the evening finishing repairs on Alex's Toyota. The work was methodical, requiring focus that temporarily displaced the weight of decision. By midnight, the engine was reassembled, and initial tests confirmed successful repair. Washing grease from his hands at the utility sink, Jack's gaze fell on his grandfather's old toolbox, scarred and worn, but still solid after decades of use. The old man had been a stubborn traditionalist, yet he had also been the first farmer in the valley to adopt contour ploughing when evidence showed it prevented soil erosion. "Adapt or disappear," his grandfather used to say. but adapt on your own terms. In that moment, Jack realized his resistance wasn't really about Hayes' Innovations' proposal itself, but about what accepting help symbolized. For years, he'd carried Willow Creek Farm alone, viewing outside assistance as an admission of failure rather than a strategic alliance. Perhaps it was time to recognize that adaptation didn't mean surrender. Perhaps, like his grandfather with contour plowing, he could embrace change while maintaining the farm's essential character. Jack picked up his phone and composed a text to Alex. "Finished your car? Available to discuss the proposal further tomorrow afternoon?" Her response came, almost immediately despite the late hour. "I'll be there at 2, looking forward to it." Jack set down the phone, a weight lifting from his shoulders. He hadn't committed to anything yet, but taking this next step felt right in a way that surprised him. Community wisdom had reinforced what he already knew in his heart. The future of Willow Creek Farm would require both honoring its past and embracing new possibilities. The morning of Jack's meeting with Alex brought an unwelcome development. A certified letter arrived from First National Bank informing him that his 6-month timeline for addressing the foreclosure had been reduced to 60 days due to reassessment of collateral value and loan risk factors. The clinical language disguised what Jack immediately recognized as mid-agro's influence. They were pressuring the bank to accelerate his financial crisis. Jack placed the letter on the kitchen table. Beside Alex's proposal, the contrast between threat and opportunity starker than ever. His phone rang before he could fully process this new complication. "Miller," he answered. "Mr. Miller, Thomas Westridge. I hope you've had time to consider our offer." Jack's jaw tightened at the coincidental timing. "Still considering? I should inform you that our timeline has accelerated," Westridge continued smoothly. "Market conditions are creating increased demand for our Willow Creek development. Our offer expires in 48 hours. "Interesting coincidence," Jack replied. "Just got notice from the bank shortening my foreclosure timeline." A slight pause. "On the line, the financial sector is sensitive to regional development plans. Banks adjust their assessments accordingly, or get pressured to do so," Jack countered. "Business is complex," Westridge acknowledged, without directly addressing the accusation. "But our offer remains straightforward, a clean exit with substantial compensation versus an increasingly precarious financial position." After ending the call, Jack drove to First National Bank in town. The meeting with his loan officer, Dave Simmons, proved frustratingly predictable. "Nothing personal, Jack," Simmons insisted, his discomfort evident. "Directives came from regional management. My hands are tied. After 15 years with this bank, I'd expect some flexibility," Jack pressed. Simmons slid a folder across his desk. "Best I can offer is refinancing with a higher interest rate and additional collateral requirements. It's not ideal, but it buys you the original 6 months." Jack left without accepting, the terms so unfavorable they amounted to delayed surrender rather than genuine assistance. Driving back to the farm, his resolve hardened. Midagro's tactics confirmed everything Alex had suggested about their approach to community acquisition. At precisely 2 p.m., Alex arrived in a company car with Hayes Innovations' modest logo on the door, a gesture of transparency that didn't go unnoticed. Jack led her to the barn where the repaired Toyota waited. "You actually fixed it," Alex remarked, genuine appreciation in her voice as Jack showed her the rebuilt engine. "Said I would," he replied simply. "Want to take it for a test drive before we talk business?" They drove together along the back roads surrounding Willow Creek Farm, the Toyota's engine running smoothly. Alex seemed content to let Jack take his time, understanding intuitively that the car represented more than just a mechanical challenge. It was the bridge between their initial meeting and their current negotiation. Back at the farm, Jack directed, them to the small rise overlooking his property where an ancient oak provided shade. From this vantage point, the entire operation was visible, fields in various stages of production, the weathered but sturdy barn, the farmhouse that had sheltered generations of millers. "I got notice from the bank this morning," Jack began without preamble. Foreclosure timeline cut to 60 days, mid-aggros making their move. Alex wasn't surprised. They've used similar tactics elsewhere, create financial pressure, then present themselves as the solution. Westridge called too. Their offer expires in 48 hours. "Of course it does," Alex replied, a hint of steel in her voice. "They know we're talking. They want to force a quick decision before you can fully evaluate alternatives." Jack turned to face her directly. "I've spent the last few days talking to people about Hayes Innovations, researching your company, your other partnerships, even visited my wife's grave trying to figure out what she would advise." This personal revelation clearly caught Alex off guard. She remained silent, giving him space to continue. "My entire life has been about preserving this farm, maintaining independence," Jack continued. "Taking on a corporate partner, any partner, goes against that instinct." "I understand," Alex said quietly. "Family legacy carries profound responsibility." "But legacy isn't just about preserving the past," Jack said, the conclusion he'd been approaching for days finally crystallizing. "It's about securing the future." He gestured toward the farm below them. "This land has been in my family for 4 generations, but every generation adapted to survive. My grandfather switched from dairy to crops when the milk market collapsed. My father diversified into vegetables when grain prices fell. Adaptation isn't surrender, it's survival." Alex studied him thoughtfully. "What are you saying, Jack?" "I'm saying I'm interested in your partnership proposal, but with conditions." Jack turned to face her directly. "I need guarantees of operational autonomy, written commitments that Hayes Innovations can't sell its interest in this project without my approval. And I want right of first refusal if your company ever changes hands." Rather than being put off by these demands, Alex looked impressed. "Those are reasonable protective measures. I'm sure we can incorporate them into the agreement." "One more thing," Jack added. "Whatever research facility you build here needs to benefit the entire valley, not just Willow Creek Farm. My neighbors need access to the same innovations and opportunities." "That's actually aligned with our vision," Alex confirmed. "Regional impact is more sustainable than isolated success stories." They walked back to the farmhouse, where Jack showed Alex the bank's letter and explained the refinancing option he'd been offered. "This is aggressive even for mid-aggro," Alex remarked. Studying the documents, "They really want your land. Question is, what can Hayes Innovations do about my immediate financial situation?" Jack asked pragmatically. "Even with your partnership, I still need to address the foreclosure." Alex considered this challenge. "There are several approaches we could take. Hayes could provide bridge financing secured against future crop sales. Or we could expedite the first phase of infrastructure improvements, demonstrating immediate investment that might persuade the bank to reconsider." She paused, clearly weighing her next words. "Or, if you're comfortable with a more direct approach, Hayes Innovations could simply pay off the existing mortgage as our initial capital investment in the partnership. The amount would be converted to preferred equity in our joint venture." Jack raised an eyebrow. "Wouldn't that essentially give you the same leverage over me that the bank currently has?" "On paper, perhaps," Alex acknowledged, "but with significantly different intentions and a mutual interest in the farm's success. Plus, all those protective covenants you just outlined would apply." They spent the next hour discussing details, financial projections, implementation timelines, governance structures for their proposed partnership. Throughout the conversation, Jack was struck by Alex's willingness to address his concerns directly rather than glossing over potential complications. "I need 24 hours," Jack said finally, "to read through everything one more time and make sure I'm not missing anything." "Of course," Alex agreed. "This isn't a decision to rush, despite Midagro's artificial deadline." As they wrapped up, Jack walked Alex to her repaired Toyota. "Thank you for fixing this," she said. "Most people wouldn't have bothered with a stranger's car. Wasn't just a stranger's car by the time I finished it," Jack replied. The words carried more meaning than he'd intended, acknowledging how their relationship had evolved from stranded traveler and reluctant host to potential business partners. "No," Alex agreed with a smile. "I suppose it wasn't." After she departed, Jack stood in the driveway considering the decision before him. 60 days until foreclosure, 48 hours until Midagro's offer expired, 24 hours until he gave Alex his answer. The timelines were converging, forcing the decision point he'd been avoiding for years. That evening, Jack called Martha to share his thinking. Her response was characteristically direct. "Jack Miller, you've been running in place since Caroline died. Maybe it's time to start moving forward again." The words resonated with him long after they hung up. There was wisdom in Martha's observation. He had indeed been preserving rather than growing, maintaining rather than building. Perhaps partnership with Hayes Innovations represented not just financial salvation, but a chance to revitalize his connection to the land itself. 3 weeks after Jack signed the partnership agreement with Hayes Innovations, Willow Creek Farm hummed with activity that hadn't been seen in decades. Surveyors mapped the eastern fields where the small research facility would be constructed. Engineers evaluated the irrigation system, designing upgrades that would reduce water usage while improving crop yields. Even the farmhouse received attention, with contractors repairing the leaky roof that had threatened Jack's hay supply during the storm. Jack stood on his porch, coffee mug in hand, watching a team install solar panels on the barn roof. The sight still felt somewhat surreal, outside investment transforming his struggling operation with remarkable speed. "Quite a change, isn't it?" Alex's voice came from behind him. She'd been visiting the farm regularly since their agreement, overseeing the initial implementation phases personally rather than delegating to subordinates. "Almost don't recognize the place," Jack admitted as she joined him on the porch. "Moving faster than I expected. We need to demonstrate visible progress." "Quickly," Alex explained, "both for your bank situation and to show other farmers in the valley what's possible." The partnership had indeed resolved Jack's immediate financial crisis. Hayes Innovations had paid off his mortgage, converting the debt into equity in their joint venture. The bank, initially skeptical, had been properly chastened when Alex's financial team revealed evidence suggesting undue influence in their foreclosure acceleration. "Midagro's gone quiet," Jack observed, gesturing toward the valley beyond his property. "No more aggressive offers to the neighbors since we announced our partnership." "They're regrouping," Alex replied, her expression serious. "Thomas Westridge requested a meeting with me yesterday, suggested our companies could coordinate development efforts in the region, meaning they're trying to buy their way into our initiative now that the direct approach failed." Alex's tone made clear her response to such overtures. "They don't give up easily." Jack nodded, unsurprised. In the days following his agreement with Hayes Innovations, Midagro had launched a brief but intense campaign to undermine the partnership. Anonymous letters questioning Alex's motives had circulated through the community. Rumors spread about Hayes Innovations' financial stability. Even Jack's loan officer had called, suggesting he might have acted hastily in accepting Alex's terms. None of it had gained traction, largely because Alex had anticipated such tactics. Before announcing their partnership, she had organized a community meeting where she presented Hayes Innovations' vision directly to local farmers, answering questions with transparent honesty rather than corporate platitudes. The contrast with Midagro's secretive approach had not gone unnoticed. "Bill Thompson came by yesterday," Jack mentioned as they watched the solar installation progress, asking questions about our arrangement. "Is he considering a partnership too?" Alex asked, trying to sound casual, though Jack could tell the question. I carried significant weight for her strategic plans, considering it, still cautious but interested, especially after seeing real equipment show up here instead of just promises. Alex nodded thoughtfully. The first partnership is always the hardest to secure. Once results become visible, others usually follow. A truck pulled into the driveway, bearing the Hayes Innovations logo and carrying irrigation components. Jack recognized the driver as Miguel, the project manager who had quickly earned his respect with his practical knowledge and lack of corporate pretension. The Eastern Field System arrived, Miguel called out as he approached the porch. "Should be installed by end of week if weather holds." "Perfect timing for the test crops," Alex replied. After Miguel returned to oversee the unloading, Jack turned to Alex with a question that had been forming over the past weeks. "Your people work differently than I expected." "How so?" they ask. Questions, listen to answers. Adjust plans based on local knowledge." Jack shrugged. "Not typical corporate behavior in my experience." Alex smiled. "That's by design. We hire people who understand that agricultural innovation isn't just about technology. It's about respecting traditional knowledge while introducing improvements that make sense for specific conditions." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of an unexpected visitor. Sheriff Davis's patrol car pulled alongside the Hayes Innovations trucks, looking distinctly out of place among the work vehicles. "Morning, Jack," the sheriff called, approaching the porch with the unhurried gait of a man who had patrolled the same rural roads for over 20 years. "Ms. Hayes?" "What brings you out this way, Tom?" Jack asked, though he suspected the answer. "Noise complaint, if you can believe it," Davis replied with a bemused expression. "Anonymous caller concerned about industrial activity disrupting the rural character of the area." Alex and Jack exchanged knowing looks. The complaint obviously originated from Midagro, or one of their allies, attempting to create bureaucratic obstacles now that direct opposition had failed. "Happy to show you what we're doing," Jack offered. "Nothing industrial about improving farm infrastructure." The sheriff waved dismissively. "No need, just doing my due diligence by showing up. Between us, I've got actual crimes to investigate rather than wasting time on nuisance calls." After Davis departed, more visitors arrived throughout the day. Some officially related to the project, others simply curious neighbors drawn by the unusual activity. Jack found himself repeatedly explaining the partnership to skeptical but increasingly interested fellow farmers. "So you still own the land?" Old Peterson asked, squinting at the solar panels. "Hayes folks don't get controlling interest?" "Land stays in my name," Jack confirmed. "They provide capital, technology, and market access. I provide farming expertise and operational management. We share the increased profits according to a formula that adjusts over time." "And if it fails?" Peterson pressed. "I keep the improvements. They write off the investment, and we both walk away wiser," Jack explained, all spelled out in black and white. By evening, the day's work concluded with the solar installation complete and trenches dug for the first section of upgraded irrigation. Jack and Alex sat on the porch again, reviewing progress and planning next steps. "Community's watching closely," Jack observed. "Success or failure here affects more than just my operation." "I'm aware," Alex replied. "It's why I've been on site so much. This partnership needs to set the standard for everything that follows." Jack studied her in the fading light, still reconciling the CEO with the woman who had helped him save hay during a storm. "Your board okay with you spending so much time on one small farm?" A flicker of tension crossed Alex's face. "There's been some discussion about resource allocation. Not everyone shares my conviction about the importance of this specific project." "Corporate politics," Jack surmised. Something like that. Alex's tone suggested complications she wasn't fully sharing. "Nothing for you to worry about." Before Jack could press further, his phone rang, Martha Jenkins calling with excitement in her voice. "Jack, you won't believe this. I just got a call from that nice woman at Hayes Innovations, the one handling community relations. They want to feature my apple pies in their farm-to-table program with restaurants in the city. Premium prices, Jack." After assuring Martha the opportunity was legitimate, Jack turned to find Alex watching him with a small smile. "Your community relations team reached out to Martha," he said, "about her pies." "Of course," Alex replied. "Our partnerships aren't just about crops and technology. They're about celebrating the complete agricultural heritage of the regions where we work. Martha's pies are part of that heritage." The gesture touched Jack more deeply than he expected. It demonstrated an understanding of rural communities that went beyond financial calculations to recognize the intangible elements that defined places like Willow Creek Valley. Later, after Alex had departed for her hotel in town, Jack walked his property alone. The day's activities had altered its appearance, trenches marking future irrigation lines, stakes indicating the research facility's foundation, solar panels gleaming on the barn roof in the moonlight. Yet despite these changes, the land still felt fundamentally like Willow Creek Farm, his home, his responsibility, his future. For the first time in years, that future contained more promise than peril. The partnership with Hayes Innovations represented not just financial salvation, but revitalization, a chance to implement the sustainable vision he and Caroline had once dreamed about, but lacked the resources to pursue. As he completed his evening rounds, checking animals and securing buildings, Jack realized he was humming, a small but significant sign of the weight that had lifted from his shoulders. Breaking ground on these improvements felt like breaking ground on a new chapter for Willow Creek Farm, one that honored its past while embracing possibilities he had previously believed beyond reach. 2 months into the partnership, progress at Willow Creek Farm was undeniable. The research facility, a modest but state-of-the-art structure designed to blend with the rural landscape, was nearing completion. The upgraded irrigation system had already reduced water usage by 30%, while improving soil moisture consistency. Solar panels now provided most of the farm's electricity needs, significantly reducing operating costs. But beneath this visible success, tensions were developing on multiple fronts. The first signs appeared during Jack's weekly video conference with Alex and the Hayes Innovations project team. What had begun as collaborative planning sessions gradually shifted as new faces joined the calls. Financial analysts and marketing executives who asked questions focused more on metrics and timelines than agricultural realities. "We need to accelerate the demonstration crop timeline," insisted Vanessa Chen, the recently appointed Director of Investment Relations. "The board is questioning the ROI projections for Q3. Plants grow at their own pace," Jack replied, not bothering to hide his irritation. "You can't accelerate biological processes to satisfy a quarterly report." "Actually, Mr. Miller," Vanessa countered, "with the growth stimulants our lab has developed, we agreed no experimental growth compounds would be used without extensive soil impact testing." Alex interrupted firmly. "Let's stick to the approved project plan." The exchange ended there, but similar conflicts surfaced with increasing frequency. Jack found himself defending traditional farming wisdom against corporate efficiency measures that prioritized short-term results over long-term sustainability. Alex consistently supported Jack's position during these debates, but he sensed growing pressure on her from within her own company. Their private conversations after the formal meetings confirmed his suspicions. "The board's getting impatient," Alex admitted as they walked the test crop fields one afternoon. "Several members feel we're moving too cautiously with implementation." Meaning, "They want faster profits," Jack translated. "Essentially, yes." Alex looked troubled. "Investment capital has quarterly expectations. Agricultural reality operates on seasonal cycles. It's an inherent tension." "One you must have anticipated," Jack observed. Alex nodded. "I did, but the board's composition has shifted since we launched this initiative. 2 new members from traditional agribusiness backgrounds are questioning our partnership approach as unnecessarily complex." Before Jack could respond, his phone rang. Bill Thompson calling with concerns about the haze equipment recently installed on his farm as part of the Valley's second partnership agreement. "Technicians say I need to change my entire crop rotation schedule," Bill complained, claiming their systems are optimized for a different sequence. "That wasn't part of your agreement," Jack replied, frowning. "Partnership terms explicitly protect operational autonomy." After assuring Bill he would look into the situation, Jack relayed the conversation to Alex. Her expression darkened. "That directive didn't come from me," she said firmly. "I'll handle it immediately." The incident highlighted a growing challenge. As Hayes Innovations expanded its presence in Willow Creek Valley, maintaining consistency in how partnership agreements were implemented became increasingly difficult. What had begun with Jack's farm as a carefully personalized collaboration risked becoming standardized as more farmers joined. Tensions weren't limited to Hayes Innovations' internal dynamics. Within the local community, divisions emerged between farmers who embraced the partnership approach and those who remained skeptical or had aligned with Midagro's competing offers. The situation came to a head at the monthly town meeting, where the community gathered to discuss regional development. Jack arrived to find unusual attendance. Nearly every farmer in the valley present, along with representatives from both Hayes Innovations and Midagro. Mayor Wilson, a retired teacher who had governed Willow Creek for 15 years, looked distinctly uncomfortable with the charged atmosphere. "Tonight's agenda includes updates on agricultural partnerships developing in our valley," he began cautiously. What followed was less discussion than debate. Farmers who had partnered with Hayes Innovations, including Jack and Bill Thompson, described positive initial results: infrastructure improvements, premium pricing for crops, and maintained operational independence. Henry Graham, whose farm bordered Jack's to the south, offered a counterpoint. Midagro's approach is straightforward: fair market value for land, no complex contracts or corporate entanglements, simple and clean. Simple until you're gone and they've got control of the water rights, Jack countered. "Have you actually read what happens after the sale?" Thomas Westridge, seated with practiced casualness in the back row, rose to address the gathering. "Midagro Industries values transparency. Our development plans for Willow Creek Valley include substantial investment in agricultural tourism, creating numerous employment opportunities while preserving the region's heritage." Alex, who had been listening quietly, finally spoke. "Interesting. Would those be the same promises made to the Jameson Valley community before Midagro pivoted to industrial processing operations? Or perhaps the same assurances given to Cooper's Ridge before traditional farmland was converted to corporate crop production with automated systems that eliminated most local jobs?" Westridge's professional smile tightened. Hayes Innovations seems extraordinarily concerned with Midagro's business practices, perhaps because their own financial position is less secure than they present. The implication hung in the air, creating visible unease among farmers who had recently signed with Hayes. Alex maintained her composure, but Jack noticed her knuckles whitening as she gripped her notebook. Mayor Wilson, sensing the deteriorating civility, hastily called for a refreshment break. As attendees dispersed toward the coffee and cookies at the back of the room, Jack made his way to Alex. "That was direct," he observed quietly. "Too direct," Alex acknowledged. "I let him provoke me, which was exactly his goal." His comment about Hayes's financial position, any truth to that? Alex hesitated fractionally. "We're solid, but there has been some investor concern about the capital-intensive nature of our partnership model. Returns aren't as immediate as with traditional development approaches." This confirmed suspicions Jack had been developing over recent weeks, that Alex's vision for Hayes innovations faced internal challenges as significant as the external competition. From mid-agro, the meeting resumed with increased tension. When discussion turned to water usage and rights, the critical issue underlying much of the valley's agricultural future, the division between competing approaches became stark. Mid-agro's development plan includes centralized water management, Westridge explained smoothly. More efficient allocation, reduced waste, consistent availability during dry seasons. Centralized under whose control? Old Peterson challenged. "It seems to me you're describing taking public resources into private hands." The debate continued, growing increasingly heated until Mayor Wilson finally adjourned the meeting with key questions unresolved. As the crowd dispersed, Jack overheard snippets of conversation that worried him. Farmers questioning their commitments to Hayes, others wondering if Mid-Agro's straightforward buyout might be simpler than navigating partnership complexities. Outside the town hall, Jack found Alex in intense conversation with her project manager, Miguel. Their expressions suggested problems beyond the contentious meeting. "Everything okay?" Jack asked as he approached. Miguel excused himself, leaving Alex to explain. "We're having issues with the specialized equipment for the research facility. Components that were supposed to arrive next week are delayed indefinitely due to supply chain problems." "How long?" "Potentially months." Alex ran a hand through her hair in a rare display of frustration. "Which would push back our demonstration timeline into next growing season. Giving Mid-Agro more time to persuade farmers their approach is better," Jack concluded. Alex nodded grimly. "Exactly. And giving my board more reason to question our strategy here." They walked toward their vehicles in troubled silence, the evening's events weighing heavily on both. "Hayes Innovations is your company," Jack said finally. "You have controlling interest. Can't you simply overrule board objections?" "It's not that simple," Alex replied. "Yes, I hold majority shares, but I still need investor confidence. Push and do hard against board consensus, and funding for future projects becomes difficult." She paused. "The Willow Creek initiative is personal for me, Jack. Maybe too personal, according to some board members." The admission revealed vulnerability Jack hadn't expected from the confident CEO he'd come to know. It reminded him that despite her position and resources, Alex faced her own constraints and pressures. "What happens if Hayes has to pull back from the partnerships?" he asked, giving voice to the concern that had been growing since the meeting. "That won't happen," Alex insisted, though something in her tone lacked absolute conviction. "I'm committed to making this work, whatever it takes." As they reached their vehicles, a light rain began to fall. Not the torrential downpour that had first brought them together, but a gentle, persistent drizzle that seemed fitting accompaniment to the evening's uncomfortable revelations. "We knew this wouldn't be easy," Jack offered, surprising himself with the instinct to reassure her rather than seek reassurance. Alex smiled faintly. "No, but I may have underestimated just how many fronts we'd be fighting on simultaneously." They parted with promises to regroup the following day. But as Jack drove back to Willow Creek Farm, he found himself wondering if the promising partnership he'd committed to might be more fragile than he'd realized. Threatened not just by Midagro's opposition, but by forces within Hayes Innovations itself. Storm clouds gathered over Willow Creek Valley as Jack secured the farm against the approaching weather. He was reinforcing greenhouse panels when Alex's car sped up the driveway. She approached quickly, her expression tense. "We have a problem," she said without greeting. "Midagro's made a formal acquisition offer for Hayes Innovations. They're trying to buy your company? It's a hostile takeover attempt. I hold controlling interest, but several key investors like the terms. The board meets tomorrow to discuss it." Jack understood the implications immediately. "If they succeed, everything changes," Alex confirmed. "Our partnerships would be absorbed into Midagro's development model. Their first move would be centralizing water rights." The rising wind rattled the greenhouse. "Storm's coming fast," Jack said. "We need to check the creek." They drove to Miller's Creek, already rising rapidly. The monitoring equipment showed abnormal pressure readings. Following the creek upstream, they found a fallen tree blocking the channel, diverting water against the vulnerable bank. "If that bank gives way, water will head straight for the demonstration fields," Jack warned. Without discussion, they began clearing the blockage, then reinforcing the bank with sandbags. The storm intensified, soaking them as they worked. Alex matched Jack's efforts without complaint, despite being clearly exhausted. When they finished, Jack's truck wouldn't start. Water in the electrical system. They walked back to the farmhouse through the downpour. Inside, with power out, Jack lit kerosene lanterns, while Alex changed into the same borrowed clothes from her first day. "Feels like déjà vu," she remarked, "though under worse circumstances." Jack handed her coffee warmed on the wood stove. "Different circumstances. Last time you were a stranded stranger. Now you're someone who just spent 2 hours in a storm trying to save my farm." "Why does Midagro want Hayes Innovations?" Jack asked. "Your companies have completely different approaches." "That's precisely why. They don't want our operation. They want to eliminate competition, absorb our patents, redirect our resources, dismantle our partnership model." "But you have controlling interest." Alex stared into her coffee. "Technically. But if enough shareholders support Midagro's offer, they could make my position untenable." After a moment, Alex spoke again. "I need to tell you something I should have explained sooner." "I'm listening." "Hayes Innovations isn't just business. For me, my mother's parents had a farm in Nebraska. When I was 11, a company called Agricor began buying properties around them. My grandfather refused to sell, even when they offered above market value. Then the pressure tactics started. New irrigation co-op rules disadvantaged smaller farms. Local suppliers raised prices. The bank found discrepancies in my grandfather's loan. When he still wouldn't sell, there was a chemical spill from an Agricor truck that contaminated their primary field. Insurance wouldn't cover it. Within 6 months, they lost everything." Alex's expression revealed deep personal investment. "My grandfather died 3 years later. The doctor called it heart failure, but my grandmother said he died from a broken spirit. So Hayes Innovations," Jack began, "was founded with a specific mission: to create an alternative model for rural development that preserves family farms while making them economically viable. I used my inheritance from my other grandparents, successful urban entrepreneurs, to build something that might have saved my farming grandparents." "Why didn't you tell me this earlier?" Jack asked. "I wanted you to evaluate the business case on its merits, not out of sympathy. And I've learned to keep that story private in corporate settings. It gets dismissed as emotional rather than strategic. For what it's worth, I think your grandparents would be proud. That's why I can't let Midagro dismantle it." Everything we've created matters beyond profit margins. Their emergency radio crackled. Flash flood warning for Willow Creek Valley. Miller's Creek Dam, showing signs of structural compromise. Residents in low-lying areas should evacuate immediately. They exchanged alarmed glances. If the dam failed, it would devastate not just the farm, but the entire valley. We need to warn people, Jack said, reaching for his coat. The research facility has emergency generators and satellite communications, Alex remembered. As they stepped back into the storm, Jack realized that despite their different backgrounds, he and Alex shared something fundamental. When crisis threatened their community, neither hesitation nor personal comfort factored into their response. 6 months after the flood, Willow Creek Valley gathered for its first harvest festival in over a decade. Colorful tents dotted Jack's eastern field, with local farmers displaying produce, artisans selling crafts, and Martha Jenkins' apple pies. Drawing long lines, the flood had become the turning point for the community. The old dam had partially failed that night, but coordinated emergency response, initiated by Jack and Alex from the research facility, had prevented catastrophic damage. More importantly, the crisis had united farmers who had been divided over Hayes innovations and Midagro's competing visions. Jack watched families arrive, noting how different the farm looked now, vibrant, well-maintained, with the research facility's modern lines complementing traditional farm buildings. "Quite a turnout," observed Bill Thompson, joining Jack with a mug of cider. "Never thought I'd see Willow Creek Farm hosting half the county." "Wouldn't have happened without the partnership," Jack acknowledged. "Or without that flood," Bill added. "Nothing like a natural disaster to remind folks they need each other more than corporate saviors." Through the crowd, Jack spotted Alex conversing easily with farmers and visitors. Dressed in casual jeans and flannel, she'd set aside her corporate persona for the celebration. Their journey from first encounter to this moment of shared accomplishment seemed remarkable in retrospect. Mid-Agro's takeover attempt had failed unexpectedly. When the flood interrupted the planned board meeting, Alex and key investors had joined emergency response efforts. Images of Hayes Innovation staff working alongside farmers to save homes and livestock had shifted the narrative dramatically. Investor support for Mid-Agro's hostile takeover evaporated in the face of overwhelmingly positive public response. "There you are," Alex said, approaching with a smile. "The governor's representative just arrived. I think you should give her the tour." "Pretty sure the CEO outranks the farmer here," Jack replied. "This is your farm, Jack, your community's celebration. I'm just a partner." The way she emphasized partner carried meaning beyond business arrangement. Before Jack could respond, Martha Jenkins whisked him away to settle a dispute about the pumpkin competition. As he navigated through the festival, neighbors and visitors repeatedly stopped him with congratulations on the farm's transformation. Old Peterson, once among the most skeptical, clapped Jack firmly on the shoulder. "You proved me wrong, Miller. Thought you were selling out. Turns out you were buying in to the future while keeping what matters from the past." Soon, Jack found himself at the microphone for the opening ceremony, speaking from the heart about what the day represented. "Harvest has always been when farmers measure their year's work," he began. "But today, we're measuring something more valuable than any crop." He gestured to the vibrant gathering. 6 months ago, we were fighting a flood that threatened everything. Today, we're celebrating not just a successful harvest, but a new vision for our valley, one that honors our agricultural heritage while embracing innovation. The festival flowed from ceremony into celebration. The research facility offered tours of sustainable technologies. Children played traditional harvest games. Local musicians played while couples danced on a wooden platform. In late afternoon, Jack found a quiet moment on the hill overlooking his property, taking in both what remained and what had changed. "Penny for your thoughts," Alex said, joining. Just thinking what Caroline would say. The farm-to-table contract, sustainable methods. It's essentially the vision she had years ago. She sounds like she was ahead of her time, Alex said softly. She was. Jack turned to face her. So are you. What you've built with Hayes Innovations is changing rural development. We've built it together, Jack. What's happening here is becoming a model we're implementing elsewhere. The setting sun cast golden light across the valley as they stood side by side, the distance between CEO and farmer vanishing completely. The board wants me to showcase this partnership at our investor meeting next month, Alex said. Would you consider presenting with me? 6 months ago, addressing corporate investors would have been unimaginable. Now it seemed natural. I could do that, he agreed. Farm will be quiet after harvest anyway. As they walked back toward the festival, their hands brushed momentarily, a small contact that neither acknowledged verbally, but neither pulled away from either. When Martha Jenkins won the baking competition, her acceptance speech captured the essence of the celebration. Recipes work when you honor traditional wisdom, but aren't afraid to add new ingredients when they improve the result. Seems to me that's what's happening on Jack Miller's farm and throughout our valley. The best kind of harvest isn't just what we grow, it's what we learn while growing it. Jack caught Alex's eye across the crowd. They shared a smile that acknowledged their journey from strangers caught in a rainstorm to partners in a vision larger than either had initially imagined, a harvest more valuable than any crop. 1 year after Alexandra Hayes's Toyota broke down near Willow Creek Farm, she stood in the same spot where Jack had first repaired her car. The barn had been renovated, its structure reinforced, while maintaining its historic character. Like everything at the farm, it represented the careful balance they'd achieved between preservation and progress. Hard to believe it's been a year, she said as Jack joined her, wiping his hands on a shop rag after adjusting one of the new irrigation controllers. Some days it feels like yesterday, he replied. Other days feels like you've always been part of this place. The observation carried weight beyond its simple wording. In the months since the Harvest Festival, their partnership had expanded in multiple dimensions. The business collaboration had flourished, with Willow Creek Farm becoming the flagship example of Hayes Innovations' approach to rural development. 7 other farms in the valley had joined similar partnerships, creating an interconnected network of sustainable agriculture operations. Mid-Agro Industries had finally withdrawn from the region entirely, unable to compete with the community-centered model that had taken root. Their departure came without fanfare, a quiet corporate retreat that nonetheless represented significant victory for the vision Alex and Jack had championed together. More personally, the connection between them had deepened from business partners to something neither had anticipated. Alex now spent 3 days each week at Willow Creek, dividing her time between overseeing regional partnerships and simply being part of the farm's daily rhythm. Her corporate apartment in the city had begun to feel less like home than the renovated guest room at Jack's farmhouse, a shift neither discussed explicitly but both acknowledged through small, meaningful gestures. The school tour is arriving in an hour, Jack reminded her. 5th graders from Riverdale Elementary. Educational outreach had become an unexpected aspect of their partnership. Classes regularly visited to learn about sustainable farming practices, connecting a new generation to agricultural heritage while introducing them to innovations that might shape their future. Tables are set up in the education center, Alex confirmed. Miguel's team has the demonstration stations ready. The education center, a converted outbuilding that now housed interactive exhibits and classroom space, represented Alex's investment in the community beyond mere agricultural production. When county budget cuts had threatened to eliminate the school district's science enrichment program, Hayes Innovations had stepped in to create this facility where students could experience hands-on learning about food systems, ecology, and sustainable technology. As they walked from the barn toward the main house, Jack noticed Alex pausing to check the progress of the experimental crop section. The test plots were showing promising results, with drought-resistant varieties thriving alongside traditional crops, creating diversity that improved both ecological resilience and economic stability. The board asked me an interesting question. "Yesterday," Alex said as they continued walking, "they wanted to know if our Willow Creek model is replicable or if its success depends on unique local factors." "What did you tell them?" Jack asked. "That the principles are universal, but implementation must be personalized." She smiled slightly. "I said successful partnerships depend less on corporate strategy than on finding the right local partners. People with both deep knowledge and willingness to adapt." "Sounds like a good answer." "It was the truth," Alex replied simply. "What we've created here works because it respects the expertise on both sides." They reached the farmhouse porch, where Martha Jenkins waited with a basket of her apple hand. Pies, now a staple product in Hayes Innovation's farm-to-table program with restaurants across 3 states. "Right on time," Martha declared. "These need to be arranged before the children arrive. They always learn better with something sweet in their stomachs." As Martha supervised their arrangement of the treats on serving platters, she observed Alex and Jack with the shrewd assessment of someone who had watched human relationships develop for over 8 decades. "You two remind me of Samuel and me when we were building the orchard," she commented. "Different strengths, same vision. That's the secret to any good partnership." Jack and Alex exchanged glances, acknowledging the dual meaning in Martha's observation, without needing to verbalize it. Their business collaboration had indeed evolved into something more personal, though neither had rushed to define its exact nature. Before they could respond to Martha's knowing comment, the sound of a school bus rumbling up the driveway signaled the arrival of their young visitors. The next hour passed in organized chaos as 35th graders rotated through learning stations. Around the farm, Jack demonstrated traditional planting techniques, while Alex explained how modern sensors helped optimize water and nutrient usage. Miguel showed how data gathered at Willow Creek contributed to climate resilience research affecting farming communities worldwide. As the program concluded and the children prepared to depart, their teacher approached Jack and Alex. "Thank you, both for this," she said sincerely. "Most of these kids have no connection to where their food comes from. What you're doing here matters beyond just farming." "That's the goal," Alex replied, "building connections that last beyond a single harvest." After the school bus departed, Jack and Alex walked to the hill overlooking the farm, the same vantage point where they had stood during the harvest festival. The view had changed with the seasons. Spring planting was underway, the field showing neat rows of green against rich, dark soil. "I had a different kind of proposal to discuss with you," Alex said after they had admired the view in comfortable silence. "Business or personal?" Jack asked, a slight smile suggesting he already suspected which. "Both, in a way." Alex turned to face him directly. "Hayes Innovations is establishing a permanent regional headquarters for our rural partnership program. We need a location that demonstrates our commitment to agricultural communities while providing necessary facilities for research and education." "And you're thinking Willow Creek Valley," Jack surmised. "Specifically, I was thinking about the Thompson property. Bill's decided to retire to Florida after all, and he's expressed interest in transitioning his farm into our partnership program with a different operational structure than the others." Jack nodded slowly, following her reasoning. The Thompson farm adjoined his property to the west, with excellent road access and flat terrain suitable for the kind of facility she described. "Makes sense logistically," he acknowledged, "but you mentioned this was both business and personal." Alex smiled, the professional CEO momentarily giving way to the woman who had helped haul hay bales in a storm. The personal part is that establishing the headquarters here would mean I'd be based in Willow Creek permanently, rather than dividing my time between here and the city. The implications hung in the air between them, not just for their business partnership, but for the unspoken personal connection that had been steadily deepening. Martha would be pleased, Jack said with deliberate understatement. She's been not so subtly suggesting you belong here for months now. And what do you think? Alex asked, her usual confidence momentarily yielding to genuine vulnerability. Jack took her hand, a simple gesture that answered her question more directly than words. I think Willow Creek Farm has always been at its best when it's part of something larger than itself, a community, a vision for the future, a partnership that brings out the best in everyone involved. The double meaning wasn't lost on either of them. As they stood overlooking what they had built together, their entwined fingers symbolized the convergence of paths that had begun with a broken-down car and a farmer who refused payment for helping a stranger. Then it settled, Alex said, the warmth in her voice confirming they were discussing far more than business headquarters. Nearly settled, Jack amended. There's still the matter of your car. Alex looked puzzled. My car? It's been running perfectly since you repaired it. That's just it, Jack replied with mock seriousness. You never actually paid for those repairs. You refused payment, Alex reminded him, playing along, rather adamantly, as I recall. True. But I've been thinking about alternative compensation. Jack's expression softened. Turns out fixing your car was the best business decision I ever made, even if I didn't know it at the time. And the best personal decision? Alex asked quietly. Jack's answer came not in words, but in a kiss that had been a year in the making, as natural and right as the seasons changing, as unexpected and transformative as rain falling on fertile ground. When they finally returned to the farmhouse, Martha was waiting on the porch with a knowing smile. About time, she declared without preamble. Some harvests take longer than others, but they're all the sweeter for the wait. As evening settled over Willow Creek Farm, Jack and Alex sat together on the porch, planning the expansion of their partnership in all its dimensions. The poor farmer who had once repaired a stranger's car for free, and the millionaire CEO who had hidden her identity, both reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. A journey neither could have anticipated, but that had led exactly where they needed to be. In the distance, the sun set over fields that would continue to evolve while remaining true to their essential purpose. Like the land itself, Jack and Alex had found renewal, not through resistance to change, but through embracing it on their own terms, creating something that honored the past while building confidently toward the future, together.